Distinguished guests, ambassadors, good morning and welcome to Atlantic Council. And good afternoon to all our friends watching in Turkey and across the world. Thank you for joining us in our new Atlantic Council headquarters for this timely discussion on the future of transatlantic relations with a focus on Turkish-US relations. Ambassador Önal, General Jones, it is an honor to have you both with us today and also all other ambassadors. I am Defne Arslan, the Senior Director of Atlantic Council Turkey programs, and I am delighted to be hosting today's conference, US-Turkish Relations under the New Era, where we aim to explore the future of the US-Turkey relationship, regional developments, and the implications of the dynamic and changing policies in three main sectors: defense, energy, and trade. We are observing the new Trump administration move rapidly to institute major policy shifts with widespread effects across these and other key issues. These changes bear significant implications for the international system and bringing not only challenges to the US and its allies, but if managed properly, it may also bring enormous opportunities. The global order is currently at the crossroads. The last year alone marked the fall of Assad regime, continuing conflicts in the Black Sea and the Middle East, and heightened great power competition. Against this global backdrop, the new Trump administration promises to leave its mark with new approaches to transatlantic security and cooperation, a new vision for the future of the energy mix, and an aim to rethink and reinvent trade relationship. As the bulwark of NATO's southern flank with rising global presence, Turkey presents as potentially a critical partner to the United States, as well all navigate this challenging and uncertain period in international affairs. With that, it is my honor to welcome General Jones, President of Jones Group International and Atlantic Council's Executive Chairman Emeritus, to the stage for his keynote remarks. Following General Jones, we are honored to be hosting Ambassador Sedat Önal, Turkey's ambassador to the United States. Ambassador, I'm greatly looking forward to your remarks. But first, I'm pleased to invite General Jones to the podium. General, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daphne, for your generous introduction and for hosting this conference. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Such a pleasure to join the Atlantic Council again today for a very timely event and discussion. And we're obviously thrilled to have our Ambassador Önal here. It's always a great pleasure to see you. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. Only 2 months ago, back in January, I was delivering keynote remarks to the launch of the 4th issue of the Defense Journal by the Atlantic Council Turkey programs. At the time, we emphasized the regional security challenges in light of continuing crises and developments in Ukraine, the Middle East, and Syria, and the role of Turkey as an essential partner in tackling these challenges. This was a week before President Trump's new administration took office. And since then, we've witnessed many changes in U.S. foreign policy, and I predict that we'll see many more. While the new administration's rhetoric and actions signal a period of change and transition in transatlantic relations, it does not change the critical role of Turkey as a NATO ally, especially in the wake of changing dynamics both in the Black Sea and the Middle East. When compared to President Trump's first term, Turkey has significantly enhanced its position as a multi-regional power. In light of the evolving transatlantic dynamics and rising great power competition, it's really critical that we reflect on Turkey's rising geostrategic influence and we deepen our bilateral dialogue to successfully navigate this period of change. I learned early in my career just how vitally important a role Turkey plays in the leverage it offers the United States in a bilateral relationship. And that, in my mind, that importance has only increased over the years. I first became aware of the might and the power and the influence of Turkey's military in 1991 in southern Turkey and northern Iraq during Operation Provide Comfort. And then again as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander and commander of U.S. European Command in 2004 when NATO actually became an out-of-area alliance in Afghanistan. Not many people know this, but Turkey offered a division of Turkish troops to help us in Iraq, and that offer was rejected, unfortunately, mistakenly in my view, by former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. But it is a fact that, contrary to what history might record, that in 2003, when the Iraq war started, that Turkey was very, very helpful to the United States in allowing overflights and allowing cruise missiles to fly over Turkish airspace into Iraq, allowing logistics to cross the border between Turkey and Iraq to supply our troops, and to allow the overflight of airborne combat troops to fly over Turkish airspace into Iraq to complete the northern encirclement of the Saddam Hussein's regime. So those two experiences for me cemented in my mind for a long time the importance of the relationship between our two countries, and not just on a military axis, but as you will hear more and more frequently on all things pertaining to economies, energy, high-tech adventures, I should say, and things like that that will make a huge difference. And it is a matter of record that both presidents have agreed to try to increase trade between our two countries to $100 billion US. And we have a ways to go, but we have a lot of different programs that are going to make that a reality maybe sooner than most people expect. But as the new administration is starting to execute its foreign policy, including ending conflicts in Europe and the Middle East, this is a timely occasion to take advantage of a new dynamism and energy in our bilateral relationships. So thank you again, Daphne, for inviting me today to this timely conference. It's a great pleasure to be involved in the Atlantic Council's Turkey programs, as well as being an honorary advisory board member of its Defense Journal. And now it's my pleasure to pass the floor to Turkey's ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Sedat Ünal. Since his appointment last year, Ambassador Ünal has done a terrific job navigating a complex time in bilateral relations. Ambassador Ünal previously served as Turkey's permanent representative to the United Nations and as Deputy Foreign Minister. Ambassador Ünal, it's my pleasure to invite you to take the floor. Thank you.
General Jones, friends, it is really a pleasure for me to be here this time as Turkish ambassador to the United States and to speak on Turkish-American relations. In the beginning, I would like to express my appreciation to Atlantic Council for facilitating this very timely event. Like other relationships, Turkish-American relations are also informed by four main factors. That is history, geography, universal values that we both believe in, and last but not least, national interests. As for history, as two staunch NATO allies, our solidarity and friendship stood the test of time, and especially throughout Cold War years. Yet, regional fallout from September 11th, and especially what we call Arab Spring, created some challenges and divergences in our relationship. Turkey, in its own geography, is like a linchpin when it comes to regional stability. Being surrounded by multiple sources of instability, conflict, from Syria to Libya, from Ukraine to Gaza, it takes regional ownership and alignment of positions of main stakeholders to resolve these conflicts in a sustainable manner. As Turkey, we have come to advocate dialogue and diplomacy rather than relying on kinetic means to determine the trajectory of conflicts. In this connection, greater convergence and complementarity between Turkey and the United States can make a real difference in addressing all these conflicts. Actually, we have an institutional framework in which we can have regular consultations and exchange views on issues of common interest. This is called Strategic Cooperation Mechanism. And this is a mechanism co-chaired by our foreign ministers. And since 2021, this mechanism has been instrumental for fruitful discussions on a wide range of issues, including fighting terrorism, defense cooperation, trade, and industry. Now, with the new administration, we are looking forward to increasing our engagement. Our presidents had a friendly and constructive telephone conversation last week. They reaffirmed their political will to enhance bilateral relations and increase cooperation on regional issues. Foreign Minister Fidan and Secretary Rubio first talked on the phone, then they met on the margins of Munich Security Conference. We are also planning new high-level engagements in the near future. As two NATO allies, defense and security cooperation has always been one important dimension of our bilateral relationship. Especially under current circumstances, enhanced coordination and solidarity have become all the more important. That is why CAATSA sanctions remain an anomaly in our relationship. We are looking forward to work with the administration and the Congress for removing this irritant from our bilateral agenda and bolster defense cooperation. When it comes to economic relations, we are happy with the upward trend in our trade in a balanced and mutually beneficial manner. Annual trade volume stands about $34 billion, and we aim, as the General put it, to reach the target of $100 billion in a gradual manner. Now, the US is Turkey's second biggest export and fifth biggest import partner already. Both Turkish and US economies are well equipped in terms of their comparative advantages and complementarities to progressively get closer to this target. Turkey's strong industrial base and global connectivity infrastructure will also be instrumental in this regard. Over the years, efforts to ensure supply chain diversification and resilience have also contributed in reinforcing our bilateral trade volume. We have significantly increased our LNG imports from USA and launched energy dialogue between relevant ministries. Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, Joint Council, Turkish-American Business Council, and American-Turkish Business Round Table are functional platforms that bring together business people from both sides and foster interaction and mutual investments. Last but not least, people-to-people contacts are also very important, and they constitute a special dimension in our relationship. When we look at tourism figures, we're happy to see again an upward trend. Last year, around 1,500,000 US tourists visited Turkey. Turkish Airlines nowadays fly to 14 cities in the US. More than 9,000 Turkish students are enrolled and studying in US colleges. These are promising figures, and they are going to increase. Regional issues also constitute an important dimension in our cooperation. Nowadays, 3 areas are of special importance for US-Turkish cooperation: ending the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, and helping Syria to put in place an effective and inclusive governance that is able to provide public services to its people and security to the region. On the war in Ukraine, from the very beginning, Turkey's position has always been not to rely on battleground dynamics, to expect them to produce in themselves elements for peace, but also to have a vision for the end game and to come up with diplomatic means to address this issue. And as you may remember, in the very beginning, we tried to bring together the parties in Turkey, both in Antalya and Istanbul. Actually, I was part of these efforts when I was in Ankara then. And the idea was to preempt the escalation of the conflict. Unfortunately, for this or that reason, we could not be successful. But after almost 3 years now, we do not find ourselves in a better place. But the need for a diplomatic way out of this conflict remains as valid as it was then. And now we are happy that new administration here in America is also putting the emphasis on diplomacy, finding a solution, diplomatic solution to this conflict. And as a country who has this experience with both parties and who has engagement with both parties, I think Turkey is in a position to bring added value to all efforts to finding a diplomatic solution to this crisis, and first and foremost, putting an end to this war, first with a ceasefire, then diplomatic negotiations. In all this, we think as Turkey, we can play a role. On Gaza, achievement of a sustainable ceasefire and putting an end to the tragic humanitarian toll and destruction remain a priority. Turkey is ready to undertake responsibility in accordance with principle of regional ownership to pave the way for a two-state solution that is the only solution that can be sustainable. On Syria, proactive engagement of international community is essential to avoid chaos and help the Syrian people to establish a functional and inclusive political system and transform Syria into a country that is at peace with itself, with the neighbors, and a source of stability in the region. For this, first and foremost, sanctions have to be lifted. Otherwise, the new government cannot deliver public services and security to its people, and the Syrian people would have been punished for the crimes committed by the Assad regime. So we should be very careful about it. This is a time for engagement with Syria, although there are challenging dimensions of this file, but only through interaction and engagement we can make sure that there is going to be an inclusive political system, and Syria will be part of this region in a secure, stable manner. Another dimension, the new government must have sovereignty on all of Syria, and its political unity and territorial integrity must be ensured, with separatist entities like STF disbanded and integrated into it. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that our relations with America hold a great promise. If we continue to exert genuine efforts and to pay attention to each other's sensitivities and existential security concerns, and engage in an open-hearted dialogue at all levels, I think we can go a long way in advancing our relations in all areas that I have mentioned in such a way to the benefit of both peoples and to the region and to the globe. Thank you very much.
And John Kasapoğlu, can I welcome you to the stage, please? How do you like? So thank you, Daphne, General Jones, Ambassador Arnal, so much for those great, terrific setting you provided for this discussion. It's a pleasure and honor to be kicking off our first panel on defense and security cooperation in an evolving geopolitical landscape. But first, just a few housekeeping notes to get out of the way. This discussion and conference is public and on the record. In the last 10, 15 minutes of this panel and subsequent panels, we'll have a Q&A with the audience. For our in-person audience, you can simply raise your hand and we will get a microphone to you. But for those connecting virtually, you can visit askac.org. Visit askac.org, click on our event, and fire away there. And finally, we encourage you to engage with us on social media using the handles AC_TR programs and @Atlantic Council. And also follow us on LinkedIn. We just established our own program LinkedIn page, so encourage you to all search and check us out there. But without further ado, back to geopolitics. The world is changing, and true to its word, the Trump administration is shaking up US policy at a time of already great geopolitical change. From Ukraine to the Middle East, we're seeing the effects of that, I think. And Turkey is both affected and affects these dynamics in some profound ways, and I hope we'll get into that shortly. We have an all-star lineup of speakers with us today. I'm pleased to welcome Ambassador Alper Coşkun, a senior fellow at the Europe program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Alper is a retired Turkish diplomat whose postings included Director General of International Security Affairs and Ambassador to Azerbaijan. Rich Outson, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Turkey programs, and a retired colonel with 32 years of government service in both uniform and as a civilian. And finally, John Kasapoğlu, a non-resident senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and an expert on all things defense. I think it's fair to say. So let me jump right into the questions. I'm going to start with Ambassador Coşkun Alper. In the past decade, Turkey has seen a steady increase of its influence across the wider region and to some extent globally, but let's stick with the region from the Middle East, Balkans, Black Sea, Caucasus, and beyond. Can you give us your perspective on how that kind of has changed the nature or potential cooperation opportunities of the US-Turkey relationship?
Yes, thank you, Grady, and greetings, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. I feel very safe next to these colleagues who I know are experts in their fields. Coming to your question, in my view, what those specific areas of potential cooperation where Turkey has displayed its influence and potential in the region represent a known reality that neither Washington nor Ankara had converged around, I think, in the past, I think it's safe to say, at least 10 years or so. What it's done, in my view, is it has brought to the fore the potential that the two countries have in terms of building synergies in these areas. And I think what General Jones alluded to by saying that the value of Turkey has always been there became a bit of a dormant reality in Washington, in my view, for the past 10 years or so. And with all due respect to everyone, I think particularly the past at least 4 years, if not more, have been wasted in terms of deepening the partnership between Turkey and the United States because of many reasons. And I think both sides have a lot of homework to do. Both Ankara and Washington have a lot of introspective thinking that they could benefit from in that regard. But what this moment represents, I think, and that was evident from the comments from the Turkish ambassador, is that there is a wide portfolio of potential areas of cooperation. But of course, the devil will be in the details. And I think one of the key elements that, again, the ambassador alluded to is that it will be key, at least in Ankara's perspective, and obviously in Washington's perspective, that the two sides respect each other's national interests, existential threats or concerns, as the ambassador alluded to. And it will depend very much on whether, in these specific areas that you mentioned, from Ukraine to Syria and beyond, where I think there is potential for a lot of synergy to be built between Turkey and Ankara, between Turkey and the United States, whether they will be able to, the two countries, long-standing allies, will be able to make the soup. The ingredients are there. And the reason why I may sound a little bit unsure about that is because of very many dynamics that undergird each of these different portfolios. Syria, for example, there is a clear path for Turkey and the United States, I think, to converge and work towards what I believe to be our shared interests, but there are also stumbling blocks that they continue to be working on. On Ukraine, I think that's potentially an easier portfolio for Turkey and the United States to build convergences. The Middle East, that might be more challenging. But I think at the end of the day, if the two countries can revert to their default long-standing ally sentiments towards one another, which I think has been missing, then that should make it easier to overcome the potential obstacles on the way.
Do you think, just a quick follow-up question, do you think you see the political will on both sides, or is it too early to say on the US side that to get to that point? Is the energy there?
It seems to me Ankara has been displaying a little bit more enthusiasm vocally. Honestly, it did so during the Biden administration as well, in the early days of the Biden administration. That didn't work out. I see the same positive messaging coming from Ankara. Washington, D.C. just seems to be rolling up its sleeves, so we'll have to wait and see.
Okay. Thanks so much, Alper. I'm going to go to John next because, Alper, you brought up Ukraine. You brought up a lot of things, which we will get into, but you brought up Ukraine, which I think is on a lot of people's minds here in this town. And John, you recently came from a trip in Ukraine, so love to get any insights about that, of course. But also, the Trump administration has been, obviously making this diplomatic push to end the war, and with very active negotiations, let's say, on both sides. This is something, as the ambassador kind of alluded to, that Turkey has been pushing for since the very, very early days of the war. So is, in your view, Turkey aligned with the Trump administration's approach? And in some of the fears around this town and maybe in Europe of a settlement that's overly favorable to Russia, what risks does that entail for Turkey?
Thanks, Grady, and big thank you to Atlantic Council and Turkey program for this event and invitation. Well, to start in a nutshell as to my impressions from Ukraine, how it is, I can talk about the technical details of the conflict, the line of contact, the territorial control, and everything, which is the good old boring things that you would hear from a military analyst. But since I have just 3 minutes for the initial remarks and also I have to address the second question, let me put like 2 striking facts to you to understand what the people are struggling there. So you are looking at the Ukrainian territorial control map and the line of contact. We tend to turn a blind eye to 20% of Ukraine under the Russian invasion and how the life it is there. The Russian military is training their drone operators on live targets, Ukrainian civilians, everyday Ukrainians doing their groceries, walking to their schools, to their jobs, with FPV drones to kill these people, actually, to gain experience for their drone operators. The Russian National Guard, Rosgvardia, is controlling every single iota of daily life in occupied parts in Ukraine. I have seen people who lost their legs in mine explosions, still using machine guns in the line of contact against the Russian invasion. There's a 72-year-old KGB officer sitting in the Kremlin whose last post was Dresden, the Stasi liaison in East Germany. He is surrounded by his like-minded comrades like Sergei Chemezov, like Bortnikov, like Narishkin. This is the last generation of the Soviet KGB ruling the incumbent Russian Federation. In the eyes of that elite, Ukraine is a geopolitical anomaly. It is a geographical manifestation. And unfortunately so is Estonia, Lithuania on this side. And unfortunately so is Kazakhstan on the other side of the Russian map. So under these circumstances, coming back to your question as to Turkey and Turkey's alignment with the Trump administration and the policy, if the deal is possible, I would ask you a counter question, what kind of deal you are talking about? If it is a ceasefire deal, I would say it is achievable because the line of contact is already stable. If one side or another gains a few hundred meters of territory, we call it a good day in terms of updating our maps. But you should keep in mind that even in a good day, in a notorious fashion in Ukraine, we have thousands of young men giving their lives. On the Russian side, because their premier wanted so, on the Ukrainian side, because they have to, because otherwise this is the Soviet Union over their heads. So that ceasefire deal is possible, but I don't think it is the right question to ask. I think the right question to ask is twofold. One, is it sustainable? Second, can this peace deal translate, can this ceasefire deal translate into a peace deal? The answer to the second question doesn't lie in Ankara, Kyiv, or Washington, D.C. It lies in Moscow, in the corridors of the Kremlin. In the corridors of the Kremlin, the Russian elite, the incumbent elite, and the forthcoming elite should answer one single question. Is Ukraine a sovereign nation? So as long as this elite, the last generation of the Soviet KGB, refuses in their mindset, in their strategic mindset, to recognize Ukraine as a sovereign nation, yes, we're going to have a ceasefire. Yes, this ceasefire can be brokered in Istanbul or Ankara. I can say that Turkey is in a very privileged position. We have seen prisoners of war exchange in Turkey. Only Turkey could pull it off. And it wasn't just regular prisoners of war. It was the Azov battalion, which the Russians see as the far right in Ukraine. We have seen that Turkey kept presidential-level diplomatic contact with the Russian Federation. At the same time, it was a major arms supplier to the Ukrainian military. The Turkish trade volume with Russia kept almost intact and even increased at a time when Turkey has been and still is co-producing drone warfare systems with Ukraine, rebuilding the Ukrainian Black Sea Navy, producing 3 corvettes of Ivan Mazepa class, Turkish Milgem class, even cooperating in very critical areas. Yes, this is possible. And if there is a country to pull it off, it is Turkey. But again, addressing a distinguished American community and with a sworn-in Trump administration, I will just wrap it up here with repeating my initial remarks. First, what kind of deal are we talking about? Second, is it sustainable? All the answers to these questions are in Moscow, not in any other capital.
So how can the international community, including Turkey, affect that calculus? Is it about deterrence, security guarantees, weapons?
We have to make sure that if the security deal, if the ceasefire deal can be achieved, we have to make sure that Ukraine stays deterrent enough, like a porcupine, if you like, with its military capabilities, so that it doesn't happen again. We have to understand one thing. This invasion is out of provocation. Indeed, we provoked the Russian Federation, and we provoked the Russian Federation by weakness. There is nothing that provokes the Russians like weakness. 2014, invasion of Crimea, but before that, 2008, the invasion of Georgia, and then 2009, the reset policy of the Obama administration. 2010, NATO strategic concept that called Russia a strategic partner of the alliance. So these are all, provocations, one another that we did. We have to make sure that the Ukrainian defense industry is capable. We have to make sure that the Ukrainian military is deterrent enough. To do that also, not only for mediating and negotiating and ceasefire talks, I see that Turkey is a great nation that can do that. Just to remind the audience here and those who are watching us, when the music stops in the Russo-Ukrainian war, there will be 2 large militaries with combat experience in Europe, the Ukrainian armed forces and the Turkish armed forces. And fortunately enough, they are both American allies, and fortunately enough, their defense industries are cooperating. We should go beyond New York Times, Washington Post, daily columns, and day-to-day domestic political discussions, and see the very geopolitical reality here, what we have as a potential. We shouldn't let that potential to be unfulfilled potential.
Thanks so much, John. Rich, now I'll turn to you, and maybe we can go to the south and talk about the other major development that's going on, of course, Syria. Last week, the big news that broke was a reconciliation, or the progress towards a reconciliation between Damascus and the YPG-dominated SDF to fold the SDF into the institutions of the central government, unifying the country and allaying some of the concerns of Turkey, hopefully. This was welcomed with cautious optimism by both the United States and Turkey. So I guess the question would be, does this mark the end of the thorniest issue in US-Turkey relations, the beginning of the end? And maybe you could briefly talk about that disagreement, the background of the disagreement, and what's left to be done to get that deal in a place where it removes this major issue.
Sure, thanks, Grady. I want to thank you and Daphne, General Jones, and Ambassador Onal for giving me the opportunity to sit with 2 good friends in Alper and John and discuss these issues with you. To answer your question in a sentence, no, it's not the end. This is one of the thorniest issues in US-Turkish relations, but it can't be considered just in a vacuum. There's actually 2 processes that are going on simultaneously here that are interplaying. One is the resolution of the Syrian revolution with the overthrow of Assad and the advent of a new regime. That brings a whole new set of problems, and there's concerns in Washington over how inclusive, how respectful of the minorities, what is the revenge urge of the Sunni majority for others, so the communities like the Druze, like the Kurds, like the Alawites, want to make sure they get a better deal in the new Syria than the Sunni majority had under the Assad regime, and that is a major undertaking because there's no institutions of rule there, and we're dealing essentially with a very nascent situation. I agree with Ambassador Onal's statement, now is the time to engage. I might disagree a little bit about sanctions timing, sanctions relief, because they're a great tool when they're lifted for behavior modification. And it is true that in a nascent situation like this, Damascus needs some help in achieving the right levels of governance. Now, this part in the Northeast, look, the United States became very vested for a good reason in 2013 and 2014 with focusing on ISIS. I myself was critical of the idea that ISIS was the real issue in Syria. I thought it was always more about the oppression and the tyranny of the Assad regime against all of its people, including the Kurds. Now, we focused on ISIS for good reason. They were killing Americans. They were destroying the stability of Iraq and of Syria. The modality that we chose for that was a group that was combat ready and had been fighting against people like ISIS for some time. Unfortunately, that also, because of their organic links with the PKK, had gained some of that combat experience fighting against our allies. This created a true dilemma that we have yet to solve. I would like to say that we are at the beginning of the end, potentially, of solving that. I said there's two issues that are working here in parallel. The first is indeed the fact that with the advent of a new regime in Damascus that's broadly perceived across Syria as better than the Assad regime, and I think has a real shot at consolidating its legitimacy if it makes the right sorts of deals. It's making the right noises right now, but there's still a lot of details to be worked out with that. But it is the case that the SDF, based on the Kurdish element, the YPG, which is an affiliate of the PKK, never was really in a position to rule all of northeast Syria. It's a demographic majority, and it's not ideologically reflective of the broad mass of people in northeast Syria. So it was an expedient for the United States, I would argue a necessary one at a certain time, to defeat the ISIS physical caliphate. And having been involved with the negotiations between the US and Turkey over how that resolves, and Ambassador O'Neill knows this well, there was always this question, what comes at the end of this? This counterterror modality, which was useful for destroying the physical caliphate, does not and never did represent a political solution to the life of the people in northeast Syria. It couldn't. And that still is the case. I think now, with the advent of the new government in Damascus, transitional government, and with Turkey's strong support, and the Europeans are jumping in to make sure that the engagement goes on and that something stable emerges in Damascus. I think the people who run the SDF, the Syrian element, not the people in Kandil who have influence over certain aspects of how the group operates, have opted to become part of Syria again. It is not going to be its own thing. It's not going to be part of a linked series of cantons, or it's going to be part of Syria. Now, it has to be done in a way that meets the legitimate needs of the people in the northeast of Syria. And that's going to require some negotiations. That goes for Kurds, Turkmen, Arabs, Christians, all the other people of northeast Syria. I am an optimist that that process can work. And one of the reasons is the other strand of this, which is the renewed dialogue between the PKK and the Turkish government, trying to resolve that running terror and insurgency campaign that has been really since 1979 and actively since 1984, the biggest security concern of the Turkish state and of most of the people in that region, southeast Turkey, also in northern Iraq, also in Syria. You can't really get to stable Syria unless that is unwound, because as long as Kandil is in an active state of war with the Turkish state, it's not going to allow its elements of control to wither in northeast Syria. Now, what we've seen is some very promising signs. The Nationalist Party in Turkey, the MHP, as well as with the government's obvious support, have reached out and said Öcalan should make a statement, which he did, calling for the dissolution of the PKK as an armed movement and its transition to essentially political participation. This is a door that has not been open for at least 10 years. And I think it's important. The United States so far is doing the right thing, which is to be basically silent on this and not try to drive this process or insist on anything. Now, there's been starts and stops in the process of ending the PKK's armed campaign against Turkey before. So much has changed, though, and the economic doors are open. Again, echoing Ambassador O'Neill's comments about bilateral trade between Turkey and the United States, it's also the truth that there's been great economic development in southeast Turkey. Most of the people in that area, Kurds and Turks alike, want the middle-class lifestyle. They want to be able to send their kids to school. They have more political rights now than they did when I started first watching Turkey in the 1990s. There's progress, and the door is open. So if that yields a political resolution, and this is how terror normally ends. You don't end terror campaigns by killing all the terrorists. That's just not what happens. There has to be a better political status quo that emerges. So we're not there yet, but the pathway is open on that. And if that is resolved, then the subordinate conflict, related conflict that involves the SDF or its YPG element and the Turkish-supported forces in northern Syria also is going to fold nicely into that. So things are aligned. It's going to take statesmanship. It's going to take patient negotiation. The United States, I think, can play a supportive, if secondary and background role in this. And then next year when we do this conference again, perhaps we can talk about the end.
Thanks so much, Rich. That was a great summary. As you said, I think we've come a long way since last fall, and hopefully we'll continue to go down that path. Alper, let me turn to you and to talk about European defense, which has been an issue that's come up a lot since Trump's inauguration. The Europeans sending the right signals that they want to get serious on their own defense. And Turkey has been a large part of that discussion. We've seen increasing contact between Turkey and European Union countries, European countries in general, I should say. And last week, the Secretary General of NATO, in fact, called for closer cooperation between the EU and Turkey. So what sort of relationship do you kind of envision there? What is Turkey's interest behind this? What would that relationship look like? And I would also note, on the other hand, however, it was announced earlier this week, I think on Wednesday, a new EU defense fund of $150 billion would exclude, among other countries, the US, Turkey, and the UK. What are the implications of that?
Yeah, thanks. I was just in Berlin on a conference on European security, and it's interesting. You know, the way the question is framed when it comes to Turkey is Turkey part of the European security architecture, and what can it do? I'm always taken aback by that question as someone who's dealt with NATO affairs for all these years. Turkey's, you know, part and parcel of what we're actually talking about. I understand the political complications, the reason why that question arises, but that framing as a starting point, of course, is where one of the problems lie. You know, two things are happening in Europe right now. One is a realization that the United States is obviously signaling that it's going to withdraw from its primary role in providing continental security. So Europe has to step up to the challenge, hence an effort to boost the defense industrial base in Europe, build the necessary capabilities. And the second, obviously, is immediate support for Ukraine. Again, related to the fact that the United States is decreasing potentially its support to Ukraine in that regard. Now, on both counts, and I think John's answer to your previous question alluded to that, the capabilities that Turkey represent is a plug-and-play natural solution to the challenge that the continent faces. But that's when you run into more complicated issues vis-a-vis the politics of the issue. And I think it's understandable, and Turkey needs to take a step back when in an EU setting this issue is being debated, that the funds that are generated within the EU for EU folks, they would rather have those funds go to EU companies. I understand that debate, but at the same time, there are practical dimensions to this, and the factual role, the factual reality that is that Turkey is part and parcel of the European security architecture. And that's where I think every side needs to play their cards correctly. One complaint I heard from many European colleagues was the Turkish position that, and we've heard it at the highest level, that this is an opportunity to advance Turkey's aspirations to become a full member of the European Union, which I think is a North Star that needs to remain there. And I've been telling my European colleagues, don't complain that Turkey's making that statement, because it's good for Turkey to keep that up there, and you should encourage that. But I think it's putting the cart before the horse in the perception of many Europeans. So that's where I think maybe Turkish signaling could be rectified, so as not to immediately run into that tripwire given the political realities in Europe. But when you look at the capabilities, the potential, and I think the bilateral inroads that Turkey is already building through cooperation with many European companies in the private realm, there's a great potential there that needs to be tapped into. So that decision of the European Union, again, I understand the premise of it vis-a-vis a European Union perspective, but I think this is a time for creativity. I worry that this opportunity right now that is there in terms of finding a way to deepen Turkey's integration with its European allies, which is already there in the NATO context, but in this new emerging framing, if we miss that opportunity, this could actually lead to some form of a decoupling with Turkish defense industry and Europe, and that is not something that would serve either Europe's or Turkey's interests.
Thanks so much, Alper. John, I'd also love to have your comment on this procurement issue, but also to introduce a separate procurement issue, the F-16 sale to Turkey. This came about through a breakthrough January of last year after Turkey gave their green light for Sweden's NATO accession. But since then, we've seen little progress, some stalling, and some, in fact, scaling back on the package. So maybe we can have your thoughts on that. Where does it stand now? Prospects and importance of this deal.
Well, first of all, it shouldn't have been that hard and bumpy road for a NATO ally like Turkey, again, to manifest it in the strategic minds or other allies, and also American strategic community, a NATO nation bordering Iran, Iraq, Syria, a NATO nation that is tackling the Russian Federation, it shouldn't have been that hard for the nation to procure a fourth-generation aircraft at the end of the day. And yes, it is a good upgrade with ISR radars. It is a good upgrade with electronic warfare suites. I think they did a very good job with the F-16 Vipers, but the airframe itself is a typical fourth-generation aircraft in the age of fifth-generation tactical military aviation. That shouldn't have been that hard for Turkey to procure that aircraft from the United States. We shouldn't even have been talking about that right now, because F-16V, technically speaking, from a defense diplomacy and defense technical standpoint, is a substitute for nations, A, who cannot afford the F-35, B, the United States have technical, defense technological predicaments in selling F-35 to those nations. Now, on the objective side of the conundrum, I got two criticisms for both nations. The first criticism goes to my home country, Turkey. Given the combat performance of the S-400 in Ukraine against the American attack MS ballistic missiles, against Ukraine's indigenous cruise missiles like the Long Neptune, and Ukraine's loitering munitions, the S-400, like mathematically, given the combat record, without any political source on that, merely military technical assessment, would the S-400 really worth billions of dollars of portfolio, Turkish taxpayers' money, going to Rostec? That's question number one. And what makes it even more complicated is that in the Russian case, in the Russo-Ukrainian war, these S-400s of the Russian Federation are connected to a larger air defense architecture and a sensors network. In the Turkish case, they're going to be standalone, so you should expect even more degradation in their combat records. So the S-400, on the one hand, with its combat record right now, on the other hand, the F-35, would it worth it? The second criticism goes to the United States. So there is another nation that procured the S-400, India. India has not been subject to CAATSA sanctions, countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act. India procured important Western weaponry, including the French Rafale aircraft, and right now the United States is working on selling the F-35s to India alongside other arms. So comparing to S-400 to the F-35, would it worth it? The question that I would ask to Turkey, but the same question extends to the United States. So if it is CAATSA sanctions for Turkey, if it is an exodus from the F-35 for Turkey, what about India? So if you explain this dilemma with the strategic importance of India and counterbalancing China with India, tell me who you got as your one and only NATO ally that can counterbalance the Islamic Republic of Iran, not only in the Middle East, but also in the Caucasus. Your one and only NATO ally that can counterbalance the Russian military. There is only one European nation that fields an army that outnumbers the Russian Moscow and Leningrad military districts. And I don't want to speculate anything to go into details. Tell me one single NATO ally that can play a critical role in the future, potentially, in even counterbalancing China. Not only in Central Asia, but also inside China, which I'm going to stop and do not further speculate into that. So with this, why Turkey procured the S-400 and why the United States was not treating Turkey equal with India, I think two questions that should be asked in this capital. The second part of the question, why we are seeing a delay and a scale down in the Turkish demand for the F-16, because there is another player coming in right now. The European option, Eurofighter Typhoon. And it is coming even in better shape because the initial deal was about Tranche 1, which is the initial variant of the Eurofighter Typhoon that the Brits were going to retire. And right now we are seeing that the deal is even better. It is going to be the new tranches, the new variants of Eurofighter Typhoon, by design philosophy and air superiority aircraft, better kinematics compared to the F-16. I would say not the best of combat readiness, given the maintenance needs. The F-16 is a better option in this regard. But good news and bad news for the United States here. The good news is Turkey is not hedging towards the Chinese option or the Russian option for a stopgap until its fifth-generation aircraft comes into play. This is the good news. So it's going to be another NATO aircraft that is stepping in. The bad news is it is a win for NATO, but a loss for American arms makers. So far, the Turkish combat aircraft market has been dominated by American solutions and American solutions only. So right now, the Europeans are driving a wedge into the gap in the walls, and there will be Eurofighter Typhoons. Now, it remains to be seen what comes next after Eurofighter Typhoon. Okay? What comes next with the British-Turkish cooperation in the tactical aviation field, keeping in mind that BAE systems also play a critical role in Turkish Khan, the indigenous aircraft, indigenous fifth-generation combat aircraft. So all this dragging feet here and the political machinations in Washington, D.C. are actually costing billions of dollars to American arms makers in one of the largest weapons market of Europe, the Turkish market.
Thanks, John. We're going to turn to audience questions very soon, so get ready. Very quickly, Rich, if you could answer this. You talked a lot about Syria, and kind of playing on that theme, I wanted to ask about a question about Turkey-Israel relations. It's fair to say that relations are close to their lows, and we've seen tensions growing over competing actions, if you will, in Syria, in southern Syria, with some of Israel's actions, and threat perception on the part of some Israeli reports, seeing Turkey and Syria as a major emerging threat. Could you give your perspective on that, and also just on Turkey-Israel relations generally? Do you see any imperatives for optimism there, or mutual imperatives bringing the two sides together anytime soon?
This is a difficult region to speak of optimism. So here's what I'll say. I think in Turkey-Israel relations, as with Turkey-US relations, there's a variation of the Thucydides trap here, right? The old concept that the rising power of one country is seen as a threat and maybe even a reason for preemptive action by another. It is an inescapable conclusion that over the last 20 to 25 years, Turkey has developed far more capable, far more potent power projection capabilities. It has grown economically. It has become a more broader-based society in terms of people's political involvement and in terms of, and sometimes that's for the good, sometimes that's for the bad. The kind of the highlight moment for that, the turning point, was in 2003 when the parliament voted against allowing US ground troops to pass through Turkey as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. That was reflective of the majority public opinion, by the way, in Turkey at the time. And we were used to a somewhat more pliant Turkey that was going to support us as it did in 90 and 91, and things changed. In addition to greater public engagement in politics, it's got defense industry that has become much more powerful and robust. It has developed a network of military bases and relationships, partnerships in Africa, Central Asia, the Balkans. It's a power player. So if you're Israel, which, by the way, has good reason, I think it was Woody Allen who once said, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get me. The history of Israel and the Jewish people shows that you have to be forewarned and forearmed against all possible bad scenarios. And a bad scenario would be, if you're Israel, the emergence of some sort of a neo-Ottoman Sunni majority mega state centered on Turkey, but also with this strong Syrian lobe now that's supporting Palestinians and against Israel and very critical of Israel. That's the nightmare scenario, and frankly, they're strategically sound to consider it. Now, on the other hand, people who know Turkey is, I think, far more nuanced policy with regards to Syria. There is no neo-Ottoman desire there, in my view. What Turkey wants is a stable partner so it can trade with and not have to worry about all the things that a dissolving Syrian state brings to Turkey in terms of its threat perception. So what's the solution to that? The solution to that is hopefully not conflict, but it is the case that both Israel and Turkey are strong allies, treaty allies of the United States. There is inescapably a role, indeed a compulsion for the United States to be involved in building down the tensions between these two. Now, it was long said, and was generally true, that even in times of tension, at least trade continued between Israel and Turkey. That actually took a bit of a hit after October 7th, 2023. But it is true that the intelligence agencies still talk to one another. And it is true that on security matters, they still have ways of discussing things. Now, I would like to see top-level engagement from the United States. This happened with Obama, by the way, between Netanyahu and Erdogan back in, I want to say this was 13, 14 timeframe. After the Mavi Marmara, he was able to do a little bit of conciliatory action. And I think now, compared to his predecessor in office, President Trump has a much closer personal relationship, both with Prime Minister Netanyahu and with President Erdogan. So the ability to exercise some personal influence in building down that mutual antagonism is there. Personally, if Syria gets put back together through the engagement we talked about earlier, Europe, the United States, Turkey, and becomes a functioning country that serves all of its people and is not a threat to its neighbors, then the risk of Israel-Turkey conflict dramatically decreases. And there's still, I remember it was just September 2023, a few weeks before the October 7th events, that we had this picture of President Erdogan and Prime Minister Netanyahu shaking hands talking about energy deals. That can be back on the table, but we do have these issues of sort of emergent and very urgent security threats that Israel and also Turkey need to have resolved, especially in the crucible of Syria.
Thanks, Rich. Audience questions now. Turning to, can we go to Bob Sakuda first, and then across the aisle?
Hi, good morning. This is a great panel. Bob Sakuda, former ambassador to Azerbaijan and official for energy at the State Department. You've talked about Ukraine, obviously the primary issue, but when you start talking to people in the broader neighborhood, the anxiety of who's next on the Russian hit parade comes up constantly. Turkey has got great potential, and could you talk a little bit about the role you see Turkey playing now, given what's going on in Washington, in the arc that basically goes from Moldova through the Caucasus and into Central Asia, in terms of helping them feel a little bit more secure? Thanks.
Thanks, Ambassador. And we can get two at a time. Yeah.
Hi, yes, Matt Kwazaborski of the Neptune Institute. Quick question: is any current NATO member asking Turkey to dial back its claim to Ukraine going back to territorial areas of 91, as well that Crimea says Ukraine? The only world leader I hear about territorial gains going back to 91 and Crimea is Ukraine these days, outside of Zelensky, is Erdogan. So I was wondering if any current NATO members asked Turkey, which is a NATO member, to soften that stance a little bit moving forward.
I think all of our speakers can really speak to all of those questions. I mean, Alper, on Caucasus, Central Asia, maybe you want to start there.
Want to take the easy question first? No, as far as I know, but I'm speaking as someone who's outside of the system, but I doubt that. And even if that were the case, that doesn't necessarily mean that the rhetoric would change. We recently saw this from President Erdogan again, which continues to surprise everyone, but I think it's a very, very firm position and an important one. What can Turkey do? The capacity that Turkey has in terms of building synergies, building defense cooperation, helping develop the defense industrial capacities and the institution building of these countries. Particularly, you spoke of Moldova, we can talk about Azerbaijan. Maybe in the future we can even talk about a larger context in the Southern Caucasus. It does so with Georgia as well, and Central Asia. These are very important elements, I think, in terms of building self-sufficiency and confidence among these nations. And one thing Turkey's done, Azerbaijan's a great example, where you and I had the pleasure of serving together, introducing NATO standards to these countries and helping them sustain that and build that. And I think that's something Turkey's doing also with Ukraine. When you couple that with the fact that Turkey now has intensified defense industry cooperation with all these countries. Add on top of that, we don't mention that enough, but really the economic dimension, Turkey's manufacturing capacity, its footprint in all of these countries is such an enormous source of power that it's a little sad that Turkey continues to have to brag about it. I think it's looking for a little bit of recognition of the fact that actually it represents something, and that's where I think the answer to your question lies. Now, again, the pieces are there, the elements are there, but one thing that I find Turkey sort of yearning for is looking for a partner to work with in these areas. One of the challenges is, and that will continue to be the case, Turkey will not choreograph its presence in these geographies at the expense of Russia per se, not in a sort of belligerent posturing, if you will. But you see a perfect example of the balance Turkey is striking in the case of Ukraine, where I think it is fair to say that it's advancing the interests of the partner country in question. So if that balance can be struck, and I think the United States, but more so I would argue Brussels in this case, Europe could be a good potential partner for Turkey to work with, but the political obstacles continue to be there, unfortunately.
Rich, John, just very brief thoughts, because I want to do one more round.
I don't think Turkey will ever or can ever, among other reasons, for political domestic reasons, back off its support for Ukrainian territorial integrity. There's a massive Crimean Tatar population in Turkey. And that said, as a matter of principle, they will continue to support that, but they'll be pragmatic, I think, in terms of supporting talks that may give less than the full loaf in that regard. As to the other thing, I'll take it back to Syria. Look, Turkey will continue to trade with Russia, and it will continue to trade arms and military training with anybody who might be threatened by Russia. In Syria, they were talking with the Russians even as they were working to kill Assad, I'm sorry, not directly kill, but arming the opposition against Assad. In Azerbaijan, they were continuing to trade with Russia while they armed Azerbaijan, well, helped arm and helped train Azerbaijan to defeat a Russian-supported force in that war. They've armed Ukraine and helped Ukraine train since 2015. They were providing lethal aid, Turkey, by open source, well before the West was ready to do so. So Turkey will smile and trade with the Russians. They have to, they're neighbors. And they will do everything they can to strengthen the backbone and the capabilities, the claws of anybody threatened by Russian expansion.
Thanks, Rich. One more. Okay, I have a question here, and then Tom Warwick over there.
My name is Walter. I just observer. Ambassador say something very powerful. People to people. Turkey has a great role to make a peace between Russia and Ukraine, because not the West European can understand even the Turks, the Russian and Ukraine as Turkish. And my question also be very clear. There will be no peace if you're only focusing on short-term peace. Then is no solution at all. And misunderstanding the culture and imposing one country or other countries, their whole way life, this is never be solution. It's only short-term solution. People to people is the solution. And Ambassador, I thank you that you say that.
Thank you very much. Tom Warwick?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is primarily for Rich, but others may have a view. I was wondering if you could expand on the idea that Turkey and Israel have common interests in a Syria that is not threatening any of its neighbors, including both Israel and Turkey. But clearly after the visit by an Israeli delegation to Washington, Israeli fears were made known concretely to the Trump administration. What advice would you have for both Ankara and Washington for how to get everyone in the region to understand this common interest rather than the divergence that is potentially a huge risk to the development of the region?
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. I think the argument I would make is simply that look at where we've been in Syria with Assad. And Assad as the butcher of his own people, as a man with a chemical weapons program, as a man who supported Hezbollah terrorism against Israel and allowed the IRGC to essentially colonize his intelligence and security. That was a worse status quo. Let's look at what happened to Syria in 2012, 13, and 14 with ISIS running around and with chaos in the country that threatened all Western nations, all allies of Israel. That's a worse status quo, right? So we've been there. We've seen that. Yes, there's things to be feared from the perspective of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv with regards to what could emerge there. But the best preventative is engagement. That's what I would say. The argument I would make is that the United States and Israel, yes, we need to engage with Damascus, but there needs to be a clear roadmap. And by the way, I don't know Ahmed al-Shara, but I've read people who have dealt with him for a decade now, and he's always asked, what's a roadmap? How do I get off the list? How do I stop being what it is that you think I am? And there was reason to think he was that. So there needs to be a careful discussion between Israel and the United States about conditionality, engagement, and carrots as well as sticks.
Thanks so much, Rich. With that, I think we'll have to conclude, unfortunately, but I encourage you to find our speakers. They're very nice, and we'll hopefully be welcome any questions from you outside. In the short 10-minute break we'll have here and reconvene in about 10 minutes for a panel on regional energy security in the spotlight. Thank you all so much.
So welcome back, everyone. Following our excellent panel on defense and security cooperation, we now turn to the topic of energy, which is my thing. And since the beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, European energy security has been under the spotlight. Turkey has and will continue to play a major role in European energy and has big potential to partner with US companies in the region to facilitate LNG exports. And energy is a complex subject that both affects and is affected by geopolitical developments on the ground, and we will be addressing to those in this session. Join me today to discuss this and more are Ambassador Jeffrey Payat, and Ebru Özdemir is online. Hello, Ebru, good to have you, and Eser Özdir. Ambassador Payat, until very recently, served as Assistant Secretary of State of Energy Resources. He needs no introduction and has joined, proudly I can say that, the Atlantic Council as Distinguished Fellow of the Global Energy Center. So welcome to the team, sir.
Thanks.
And he also recently, actually just this week, has become the Senior Managing Director for Energy and Critical Minerals at McClarty Associates. So congratulations with that as well. Ambassador Payat, thank you for your service and many years of incredible work you did in the region at a very challenging time, and also thank you for your continued support to us. You know, just thank you. I hosted you in Istanbul many times, right, and elsewhere. So looking forward to working with you. Ebru Özdemir is the chairperson of Limak Holding, one of Turkey's women leaders. And Limak is Turkey's largest one of the largest conglomerates, and they have energy investments all over Turkey and around the region as well. Ebru is also a member of Atlantic Council's International Advisory Board, which I am proud to say that we have been working very closely with her for many years now. And finally, Eser Özdil. Eser is a non-resident fellow of Turkey programs and a leading expert on Turkey's energy sector, former Secretary General of PETFORM, which is Turkey's petroleum associations. And Eser is someone that I am also proud to be working with for many years. Once again, thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I'm pleased to jump into questions, given that how limited time we have, and we have many things to talk about. So Ambassador Payat, if I may start with you first. Maybe we can, I have many questions, but maybe we can start with a general framework. If you can set the tone with the Trump administration's new energy policy, how it differs from the past and now, and how this will have an impact on Turkey and the region,
right,
given the differences. So if you may. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daphne. Thank you for the warm introduction, and thank you for the enduring partnership. I was reminded literally in my second week as Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, I was in Istanbul for the Atlantic Council Conference. We were together in Istanbul 5 months ago, feels a lot longer, in October for a discussion of some of these same issues. Since then, I would argue Turkey's role in a rapidly evolving European energy map has only become more important. I was reminded of that last week when I was in Houston, along with Minister Bayraktar for Sarah Week, and I would commend to everybody his remarks, which were quite important and I think reflected a lot of hard work that was done during the Biden administration, as Ambassador Onal pointed out, to grow the US-Turkey strategic energy relationship. I was delighted to be part of Minister Bayraktar's engagement with Secretary Granholm last year for the US-Turkey Council. I hope very much that Secretary Wright will prioritize the same in his engagement, because you have a couple of different factors coming together. The most important, of course, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its weaponization of its energy resources, Europe's remarkably fast decoupling from Russian energy supply. And if there was one big takeaway from Sarah Week for me last week, it was the unified and clear message of European political and corporate leaders in terms of their determination never to go back to a situation of dependence on Russian gas. So that puts Turkey in a particularly important position, both because of its infrastructure and the investments that it has made over many years. You have, of course, the singular example of the Southern Gas Corridor, which I was involved with as U.S. Ambassador in Greece and played an absolutely indispensable role in helping Southern Europe to weather the cutoff and weaponization of Russian gas beginning in 2021, before the full-scale invasion, but also massive increases in Turkey's own regasification capacity and import of gas. Ambassador Onal mentioned the increased volumes of U.S. LNG imports, which of course we welcome. The numbers are really quite striking, and Minister Bayraktar uses the figure of 75 to 80 BCM of capacity that Turkey now has across its 5 regasification terminals. Turkey has signed a number of contracts for significant volumes of LNG import. In fact, when Minister Bayraktar and I were together in September of 2022, in that first meeting, we began what became a series of discussions about U.S. LNG imports from the U.S., talking about the challenges that BOTAS faced in terms of its creditworthiness. But today you have agreements, most of which will come online next year, for 4 BCM contracted with Shell, 1.6 BCM contracted with Total, an ExxonMobil contract for 3.5 BCM. So you're talking about significant new volumes, and very importantly, this year, 2025, we'll see the expiration of Turkey's contract with Gazprom. And I think we all should hope that the volumes that Turkey contracts in the future from Russia are reduced to the extent possible, recognizing Russia's demonstrated record of unreliability as a gas supplier, but also the availability of alternatives. And I would just finish up in this opening point by noting that for me, the US-Turkey energy relationship is not just about gas. It's also about the strong message that Minister Bayraktar sent to Secretary Granholm and again in Houston last week in terms of interest on civil nuclear cooperation, small modular reactors, the significant role that Turkey can play in a world where we are seeking to diversify our supply chains for critical minerals. Daphne kindly mentioned my brand new role at McClarty Associates. And a significant part of that will be the work that I will be doing to support American and international companies looking to tackle the challenge of how we de-risk our excessive dependence on China for both the mining and the processing of the critical minerals that are needed to power the energy transition. Turkey, of course, has thousands of years of history with mining, but also has the industrial capacity to play a role also in processing. So there's significant potential there as well. And then renewables, which has fallen off the radar scope a little bit, but it's worth noting that here in the United States, as in Europe, the transition to an electrified economy is moving full speed ahead. In fact, it's accelerating. And Turkey, of course, when I was back in Istanbul the last time I flew from Athens, and as you fly across the Thracian Peninsula, the first thing that jumped out at me, not having done that trip for a couple of years, is wind turbines everywhere, which is a reminder of Turkey's significant potential to be a major generator of clean power, but also over the long term to leverage Turkey's connectivity to a European market that, as I emphasized, is looking to diversify away from the historical dependence on Russia as a principal energy supplier. So there's a whole lot for us to do, and delighted to be able to partner with the Atlantic Council as we pursue that objective.
Thank you, Ambassador Payat. You know, I will have lots of follow-up on what you just started, but if I may, I'd like to turn to Ebru Özdemir. You know, I'm not sure where to look at, you know, just so because she has been very patient as we have some time shift as well, and she is joining us from Turkey. Ebru, welcome, and thank you for joining this panel as one of Turkish women business leaders. And if I may, you know, just since Ambassador Payat, you know, just concluded his first part with renewable energy, Maybe we can start with that, with you. Turkey has been aggressively investing in renewable energy resources for several years, and looks like new administration in the US is deprioritizing of clean energy impact the momentum in Turkey and around region towards renewable energy. So given that, what is your position, and especially, from investor perspective and also Turkey perspective, just regarding setting the map for, renewable energy investment in Turkey and in the region, and how this can create an opportunity for Turkey-US business, or Turkey other regional, just European business cooperation in the region?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to Daphne and also the Atlantic Council. Unfortunately, I'm not here with you today. I wish I could, but due to business meetings here, I couldn't come to DC, so no problem. I mean, I have been following the conference, and congratulations for the successful conference. As the ambassador said, yes, the Turkish renewable energy investments are really going on the full speed, and not even full speed, in a really accelerating way. And we actually started, and we're also an investor. We have done many solar plants and geothermal plants and even hydro plants. And we just completed one, which is the second biggest in Turkey, 140 megawatts in Turkey, in the south of Turkey. So what I want to say that we have started, as Turkey, we have started investing in renewable energy before the Trump administration, long before. And we see that it will continue in a more bigger scale. And very recently, the Turkish government also made more tenders on the renewables to increase the capacity. So why it is like that? Let me give you a couple of reasons. First is, we are a big country, and we have growing energy needs, and also in the region there's growing energy needs. Currently we are also transferring some energy to even Syria. So our regional role in energy also makes us grow in energy. And in this investments, the renewables play a really critical role. And currently we have 116 gigawatts of power generation capacity, and we are the 5th in Europe, 13 in the world. And the share of renewables, which is increasing, in our installed capacity is now reach up to 59% at the end of 24. I think this is a sustainable achievement. We are really growing in this very silent but a progressive pace. And from solar to wind to geothermal to hydroelectric, I think we have more potential. And I think you'll see more growth in that area. And this will never change. I mean, we don't expect this to change, because in the renewables and sustainability is actually finance. And the global trends, we see that the sustainable global trends, you see that the finance is coming to the renewables. So the shift is there, especially also in the Europe. And this is going to continue in the near future for sure. So which means that there's a sources of financing, and there is the capacity in Turkey. So you'll see more potential here. And the third is the Turkey's long-term goal. Turkey has long-term goals. As everybody knows, our goal to be net zero by 2053, we have a very long-term commitment. The government already expressed that. And this requires planning and sorting out issues currently with the grid stability and the grid capacity and the energy storage. And we have a goal of 41% reduction in emissions. It's by 2030, it's a very important step. In order to achieve these, we have to increase our pace. And our national energy plan says that our existing 30 gigawatt of wind and solar installed capacity has to be reached to 120 gigawatts by 2035. So which requires actually investments around more than $100 billion. So if we have that need, and if we have this road map clear, and we have many local investors as well. In the latest YECA, we saw that many local investors are very active. So what we expect is, as our growing energy needs, the regional role, and the sources of financing, and the global trends, we'll see that there's going to be more investments in Turkey in renewable energy. And maybe I'll come to that later, but this also creates a very big potential for foreign investors as well. So we feel like the trend is going to continue in Turkey.
Thank you very much, Ebru. Just so, since this is related, I really like to continue with you a bit, especially, what policy incentives or reforms are needed to unlock the sustainable financing for the next stage of energy transition? According to you, are also, heading your, investment group back in Istanbul. The main hindrances to the large-scale development of renewable energy projects are the lack of bankability normally and the inability to align investments and investors with suitable financial instruments. So given that the new US administration policy is leaning back to fossil fuels, how do you see the challenges? How this will have an impact on the financing part of the renewables and energy, and also on the top of that, plus the energy transition financing?
I always say, and also we are working with Atlantic Council on a report for the sustainability in finance and how these go together. So sustainable financing is crucial for all, especially private sector. I mean, we don't have $100 billion of equity to realize all these projects. So this year, when we publish the report, hopefully we'll see with Atlantic Council Turkey program, we'll see how the issues are going to be addressed. So in order to do that, we have to definitely transform the infrastructure. So from the energy generation to energy transfer, now we're talking about storage. We have high capex, high costs of investments. And also the other thing is the requirement of the long time frames. Actually, in 2016, Turkey introduced a renewable energy resource zone plan, YEKA model, which the current tenders are being planned under this, where there is a feed-in tariff, and the government is paying this feed-in tariff for a certain period of time, so that this is used for the financing. But I think we need, with the governments, the financial institutions, and the private sector, we need to work together and cooperate, and we should be able to find better models, maybe to address, or longer term models, because enormous financing is needed. And the other thing is, I feel like that the PPPs, where we also use actively in Turkey, and this is also called Turkey model, is going to remain as a strong and effective model to realize this, because this brings together the public and the private sector expertise. The public sector definitely enables the private sector to perform these. And we have a great experience, as I just mentioned, that I would like to share here recently, that we have built a solar power plant project, which is sizable for Turkey, 140 megawatt, under new YEKA model, which is a renewable energy resource zone mechanism. And we will be seeing this in the coming days, where we do the investment, but the government allocates you the land. It helps you to sort out the land and the permissions, so that we bring the financing, realize the investment, and after that, there's a feed-in tariff mechanism so that we sell our energy. So I think this is a great model that we can use in the sizable methods. And I think we are now having more tenders on the storage, energy storage, where it's going to be also a very big model. Because what we see right now is we need definitely foreign investments, and United States could be United States private sector, which we don't see much, could also create good partnerships and joint ventures with Turkey to invest and to finance these renewable energies. And on top of it, what we see is why I say that the renewable energy is going to have more potential, because with the increase of the new developments or the new technology and the transfer and the new innovation methods in the clean energy, we see that it's going to be much advanced technologies are going to be introduced in the coming days in the clean energy. Both countries have advanced technologies in this sector, and what we can do is we can facilitate the transfer of these technologies to mutually projects, and at the same time joint research and development initiatives can also foster the innovation. And Mr. Ambassador said that as well. I mean, the strategic energy partnerships can also be formed, but and in Turkey, we are one of the investors, but we have many powerful local investors. And I think to increase the size and the capacity, it will be great to put our strengths together with the American investors.
Thank you, thank you very much. From there, just as we talk about, just Turkey, U.S. Energy Corporation, U.S. Business Energy I will move to Eser. And maybe he can give us some insights on the last week agreements with Turkish Petroleum announced a major agreement with 2 American energy companies. Mm-hmm. Actually, one of them is American and the other is a bit Turkish-linked American. But still, U.S.-based, to develop shale fields in Southeast Turkey. Mm-hmm. I think this is not only important for booster the kickoff of this relationship, but especially focusing that this will be held in Southeast Turkey. It will also have some other implications for the economic empowerment of the region in Turkey as well. So could we please get your insights on the agreements and why this is important? So
sure, definitely. The minister, Mr. Bayraktar, says that Turkey is following a smart energy transition in the country, which means that on one hand, Turkey will continue to invest renewables, but on the other hand, Turkey is also looking for increasing the domestic oil and gas production as well, and looking for other lucrative fields around the world. So the Turkish Petroleum, that's why have been investing a lot to a Black Sea drilling campaign, especially with the Sakarya gas field. So nowadays it is producing 6 million cubic meters per day, and the annual capacity is around 3.5 to 4 BCM, and it will further increase to 15 BCM, which will cover almost 25% of the domestic need in Turkey. But on the other hand, through partnerships with other international companies, Turkey is also trying to increase the production in the southeastern part of the country. Because for last 35 years, basically, almost 2020, this part of the Turkey was untouched due to PKK problem. And after the campaign in 2022, Turkey discovered huge oil field in Gabar. Now it's producing around 65 to 70,000 barrels per day, and the capacity will increase to 100,000 barrels per day, which is going to be the 10% need of the Turkey from one single field. And that's why Turkish Petroleum, along with partnerships Transatlantic and other American companies, they would like to increase the capacity in the southeastern region of Turkey via fracking technology. So basically, the American counterparty will bring fracking technology to Turkey. So that's why it is going to be the first kind of cooperation between Turkish and American companies in the fracking business. So that's why it's particularly important.
Thanks, Eser. I also like to, from here to move to Turkey's, recent gas production potential, and especially touch base, as Ambassador Payat also mentioned. It is particularly important not only for European energy security, especially Southeast Europe, but also now there's also a demand coming from Iraq and Syria. Just so. Last year, from Sakarya gas field reached 6 million cubic meters per day, but enough to meet the demand of 2.6 million households. Yeah. And recently, I think this is about 7.5 million cubic meters per day, with a plan to tap 20 million per day by 2026. Yes. So what do you see the potential there and in the Black Sea natural gas to meet this demand even more, to help Turkey to become the energy hub that Turkey is envisioning to become, just in the near future, and also its impact for the broader region?
Yeah. When Ambassador Payat was talking about the Turkey's contribution to regional security, I turned to 2012 and 2013 when I was the Secretary General of PETFORM. And we were talking about energy security of the country. The widely accepted definition of energy security is physical availability of energy resources at an affordable price. So we have first, it should be physically available. Then the second, the price should be affordable. If the prices are not affordable, then again, we will not be able to talking about energy security. In 2012 and 2013, we were advising the Turkish government to increase the gas infrastructure flexibility and diversify the resources through the world in order to get more affordable natural gas prices from the suppliers. And basically, our key recommendation was the Turkish government to increase LNG regasification capacity, plus make online some FSRU investments inside the country. And in 2015, when the first day of the then Minister Berat Albayrak, we downed the Russian jet in the Syrian border, and basically this supply security question became the most popular topic in public as well. And then I do remember very well, the Supply Security Department, Mr. Murat, invited me to the ministry and said that, Eser, please come to here, and you were talking about LNG that much. Please give us some insights how we can increase the cooperation. And then I said to Mr. Murat very well, I do remember very well, look, you need to focus on FSRUs because FSRUs are the most and the fastest, most effective and the fastest solution in order to increase regasification capacity. And if you further incentivize FSRUs in Turkey, then basically we can increase regasification capacity. With this flexibility, we can get LNG from all around the world. And then basically, that was the first project, and the Turkish government implied in 6 months, the first FSRUs became online in Turkey, and then the capacity extension of LNG facilities, other FSRUs followed this project. Why that was very critical? Because we assess dependency ratios into metrics. The first, annual dependency to a single supplier. The second, the dependency ratio to a single supplier in the coldest day of the winter. So Turkey was more than 50% dependent to Russian gas before 2015. And in the coldest days of the winter, the dependency were reaching almost 70%. So back in 2017, when USTDA supported reverse trade mission, I see Carl was one of the biggest supporters of that project. We brought all Turkish LNG importers to the United States, and we put them together with LNG suppliers from the United States, including Cheniere, Venture Global, Freeport, all of these companies. And thanks to that kind of cooperation, Turkey became one of the leading LNG importer from the United States. So why I explained all this picture in together? Because we were not only advising the Turkish government to ensure supply security of the country. As the industrial representatives, we were believing that Turkey can play a major role for the supply security of all Southeastern European countries. And now, today, Turkey has the biggest LNG regasification capacity in the region, far more than other countries. I think Greece has like 10 BCM of capacity right now, but the Turkey is more than 50 BCM, so it's 5 times more than the Greece. And Turkey had been the country supplying natural gas to Bulgaria, to Moldova, to Romania after the war in Ukraine. So still there is ample capacity in Turkish LNG terminals, which is easy to supply more than 15 to 20 BCM if interconnection point capacities between Turkey and Bulgaria is increased. The same capacity between Greece and Turkey is commissioned again, which is in place. And the Turkmenistan started to supply Turkey very recently through a swap deal, Iran. And we know that Turkmenistan wants to turn to West for the more suppliers, and they want to create new markets besides to China and Russia. Again, we know that the capacity between Turkey and Iran is 20 BCM. The 3 BCM is a very small amount, so that's why we can further increase, and which brings Turkey to do crossing road all of these energy resources between suppliers and consuming markets. And I know that the first cooperation between Turkey and the United States started in 2017 between the LNG, but still untapped potential is huge.
I will move to Ambassador Payat, but since you touched base, especially FSRUs, just so there are talks between BOTAŞ and Egypt as well. just for Egypt to acquire, or rent to one of the FSRUs that Potash owns. This is also will be a significant step in the region as well. Can you also just, enlighten that our audience on the details?
Yeah, definitely. There are talks between Turkey and Egypt for the chartering of an FSRU vessel, because Egypt is struggling to cover their natural gas and electricity demand, especially in the summer time for the last 2 years, basically. As an interim solution, Egypt is looking for FSRU. They chartered one for 10 years, but they are looking for another one. And basically, FSRUs, both the regasification terminals and LNG vessels. So FSRUs are very flexible tools, even to bring LNG from the liquefaction plant, from the resource. So that's why Egypt is an important country in the region, as Potash can chart one of the FSRUs. Maybe other American companies can be the supplier for the LNG for the region. This is going to be an interim solution, but it's an important step.
Thank you, Eser. And Ambassador Payat, so we need to talk about Ukraine a bit, as the time permits. So as efforts are being made to end Russia's war on Ukraine, could you please share your perspective on what impact a resolution could have on regional energy dynamics? And do you expect Russian sanctions to be halted really at the end of these negotiations? And I also keep reading, and thank you for one of the articles you also shared, I also read some other relevant. Russians are approaching actually the countries like India, and other potential buyers to sell more oil and gas, claiming that sanctions will be over soon. So can we elaborate these things, and also, maybe a touch base also, just the implications on Ukraine, and yeah.
Good. How many hours do we have?
Well, I'll give you 5 minutes.
Good. So let me take one of those.
It's a long question, but this is important.
No, it is. It's critically important.
Thank you.
I want to just circle back very quickly to what Eser was saying on LNG, and also to emphasize another critically important message from Sarah Week last week, which is an incredibly bullish mood among U.S. industry, who point out that today the United States has become the world's largest gas exporter, but by 2030, our liquefaction capacity here in the United States will more than double. And already in the first weeks of the Trump administration, we have seen Secretary Wright authorize several additional non-FTA export permits for U.S. gas. These projects are breathtakingly expensive, billions of dollars, and take several years to unfold. But the point being that the United States is going to have an incredibly powerful gas export tool, and Turkey, for the reasons that Eser described, is an optimal partner for those discussions. I also want to circle back to something Ebru said, because I really appreciated her presentation and her very pragmatic, all-of-the-above approach to energy availability, echoing very much what Minister Bayraktar conveyed in Texas last week. The point I would emphasize, in a world that is requiring massively increased volumes of electricity for everything, for what the IEA calls the electrification of everything, for electric vehicles, for cooling, for hundreds of millions of people entering the middle class who want the same things we have, refrigerators, big screen TVs, all the rest of it. It is an unarguable fact that today, the fastest way to bring additional power onto the market is clean. So if you look at just statistics here in the United States, American Clean Power, one of our trade associations, points out that 97% of current interconnection permits in the US system are for wind, solar, or energy storage. The market is going in that direction, not for climate-driven reasons, but for pragmatic and cost reasons. Because if you want to build additional generation capacity and you call up GE Vernova or Siemens or Mitsubishi today and say, hey, I want to buy grid scale turbine, they'll say, great, send us a check and we'll have it ready for you in 5 years. So there's actually, there's a natural synergy there. And on Ukraine, and speaking of synergy, I want to start by strongly endorsing Ebru's call for closer collaboration between Turkish and American business in this energy space. That'll be a big part of what I want to do when I start my role at McLarty. Ukraine is particularly important in that regard, because if we are fortunate enough to see a cessation of hostilities in the weeks ahead in Ukraine, the world, and Europe in particular, is going to face an enormous task of reconstruction on a scale similar to that of the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. The IMF has put an estimate of about $500 billion, $500 billion of reconstruction expenses. Because Putin has destroyed so much of Ukraine's energy sector, about 50% of generation, energy is going to be right at the front of the queue in terms of restoring the viability of Ukraine's economy. Turkish companies will play an obvious role there. When Daphne hosted me in Istanbul in October, along with the Atlantic Council Conference, one of the things I did was go to visit the CEO and management team of Karpowership. Karpowership is one of the only companies in the world that has a demonstrated capacity to deploy ship-based grid-scale power generation, gas power generation systems. They are doing it in Guyana, they're doing it in Africa. We were actually very close in the Biden administration to a deal to deploy a Karpowership vessel to Odessa. KPS was working closely with DTEK, Ukraine's largest private power company, and with Ukrenergo. After last night's wave of Russian drone attacks on Odessa, one of the biggest of the war, it's probably not such a bad thing that that deal didn't come together. But even beyond the current winter and the current situation, there has been a massive degradation of power generation capacity, especially in southern and southeastern Ukraine, where so much of the industry is. So there's a natural application of the Karpowership technology. But the same applies to all of the other areas of large-scale engineering and manufacturing, where when I was ambassador in Kyiv, Turkish companies were always at the front of the queue, where Turkish companies have a long history of involvement. And I'll just share one last story, which I think captures it for me. And I know General Jones will appreciate this. On one of my military visits, I was with General Hodges, who in those days was the commander of Army Europe. And we were flying down to Dnipropetrovsk for the day. And because the USAEUR pilots, the aircraft, were not certified to fly into Dnipropetrovsk, we were actually flying on a Dutch C-130. Not particularly comfortable, wonderful pilots, great hospitality. And as we landed on the very bumpy Dnipropetrovsk runway, General Hodges looked across to the terminal, and there was a Turkish Airlines 767. And he pointed out wryly to me that obviously Turkish Airlines didn't face the same constraints as Army Europe in terms of deploying their assets into Ukraine. I am quite confident that as Ukrainian airspace opens up, Turkish Airlines will be one of the first in line, that when it comes to the task of rebuilding roads, rebuilding all of the infrastructure that Putin has destroyed over the past brutal 3 years, Turkish companies will be at the front of the queue. I hope very much that American companies will be their principal partners. And I think as the collective West, we will face a challenge. And I know, because I've heard President Zelensky say it in closed-door meetings, the Ukrainian government will see the United States and American business as a principal partner, but we have to get organized for that day, because we won't have the luxury of 18 months to deal with the planning and supply chain challenges that reconstruction will require. So that's a subject for another conference, but I expect energy to be front and center when we get to that discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have a 5-minute warning, so I'll quickly turn to Ebru. Just so Ebru, maybe you can wrap up with whatever else is remaining, in your basket, but especially, I really like you to, as a businesswoman, to touch base more, just on potential Turkey-US energy cooperation, and how this may have a impact, actually positive impact on regions' capacity as well. And so I will leave there, and then I will give you 2 minutes to wrap up. So I'll also turn to Eser for another question before the question.
I'll be quick. I'll be quick, and I'll be very quick. The thing is, as the ambassador said, it's Turkish companies, and I'm talking on behalf of the Turkish private sector. We are very, very entrepreneurs, and we are very courageous too. So if anything is going to be done in Ukraine, I think the Turkish and Americans, we can get together to do that. So this cooperation we are talking is not only for Turkey. We can take it to the other countries, even like Africa. And as you said, like Carship is a great model, very, very ambitious. Plus, like they're pioneers in supplying energy to wherever the energy is not needed. So currently, what we think is Turkey can be an energy hub because of a regional player, and we can. I mean, in the gas, I generally talk about the renewables because, as the ambassador also clearly stated, the financing is there. And the private sector needs this financing. And for this reason, we'll see more and more in renewable energy, not only in Turkey, but also in Africa. Now we're receiving many proposals from Europe and every other country. And also in Syria. I mean, what can you do without energy? Even the airports or any industry will not run. So this means that energy is a priority. And in a nutshell, as Turkish companies, we are ready to cooperate with the US companies, not only in Turkey, but also in Ukraine, but also in Africa, and also the countries after the war like Syria, Lebanon, and so forth.
Thank you, Ebru. You know, just Eser, I will turn you with my last question because I also like to give the floor to questions, but maybe Ambassador Payet also may be willing to jump in as well on Turkey and Syria. What are the opportunities and challenges for cooperation in energy in the sector? And also, given that, you know, just so whether this can actually bring some potential to revitalize also relationship between Turkey and Israel as well, you know, just given the potential there and also in the region. So when things settle, of course.
I will try to be very quick. Basically, Syria needs money, right? We all agree about it in order to finance the public services. And following the agreement or rapprochement between the YPG and the Damascus government, al-Shara, I think the fastest thing that Syria can do to rehabilitate the oil production regions, especially in the northern Syria, than to connect these oil facilities to Turkish grid. Basically, the Turkey-Iraq pipeline is just 60 kilometers far away from the fields in northern Syria, and it is very easy to connect these fields to that pipeline because the agreement will be expired between Turkey and Iraq next year, so there is going to be idle capacity for almost 2 million barrels per day. So that's why we know that in the highest level of oil production in Syria was 500,000 barrels. So there is a capacity over there to bring the Syrian oil to international market. And for the rehabilitation of the field, for the construction of a pipeline, the Turkish companies, Turkish Petroleum International Company, BOTAŞ, or other private companies can play a greater role in order to bring it. For Israel, I am still very optimistic about the energy cooperation between Turkey and Israel. Just before the military exercises, Turkey and Israel was very close to sign an agreement in order to bring Israeli gas to Turkish market. And I think still we can come back to that base.
That's great. You know, we have 41 seconds, so if we want to take one sentence from Ebru and Ambassador Payet and Eser again.
Just very strong strategic convergence between Turkey and the United States in helping Prime Minister Soudani to reduce Iraq's dependence on Iran and Iran's energy coercion, which is significant. And in that regard, it's worth remembering that not only is there the important role of the ITP pipeline, something that Secretary Blinken and Minister Fidan discussed on a number of occasions, but also that the largest power interconnection into Iraq today, of non-Iranian energy supply, is also from Turkey. So this is another illustration of Turkey's interconnectivity role.
Thank you. Eser?
I'm done.
Done. Ebru?
Yeah, same is not only valid for Iraq, but it's going to be the same for Syria, and probably also, you know, as we have sold LNG to the Western Europe, it's going to be the same way too. So energy, Turkey will definitely be a regional player and an energy hub in the coming days.
Thank you very much. We have audience questions. So if you can also introduce yourself and your affiliation, you know, if I may start with this lady and then.
Yes, thank you very much. My name's Crystal Stabell. I'm with the United States Energy Association. And one of the energy sources I am very interested to learn more about is nuclear energy. Turkey is trying to bring about 20 gigawatts of energy by 2050. But my question for you is, especially given all the financing, all of the issues you mentioned already when it comes to natural gas, is this something that you think that Turkey should be investing more in, or would they be better off, frankly, to be putting those resources elsewhere? What do you think about that?
You want to take? I can take.
Yeah, I can do.
Yeah.
Basically, we need to understand the Turkey's energy policy concept. The Turkey's energy policy basically relies on two pillars. The one, in order to diversify the resources, and two, in order to increase the domestic production. So basically, if you look at the national energy plan, Turkey will heavily invest into renewable energy resources in the years to come. And also, Turkish Ministry of Energy considers nuclear power as sustainable baseload resources in besides to natural gas power plants, I mean the CCGTs. However, we know from the international talks that Turkey is in favor to cooperate with the countries or the parties which will able to create its own financing resources as well. So that's why the Akkuyu was signed between the Rosatom, because the Russian state came with their own financial resource. And then basically the negotiations between Japan and Turkey failed because of Japanese government was unable to finance another $20 billion of the project. So what's going to be very critical for the SMR companies, especially when it comes to US, if they can generate their own financial resources via US Exim Bank or other international financial organizations, then basically US companies can play an active role in Turkey's nuclear energy future.
Ariel Cohen, the Atlantic Council. Azerbaijan and Turkey are working very closely together in a number of strategic issues, and we saw Azerbaijan and Israel on the 17th of this month signing an agreement on 10% of Tamar field and additional agreements on Sokar exploring in the Israeli continental shelf. Do you think this was coordinated with Ankara, and do you think that there are possibly other projects that Azerbaijan, Israel, and Turkey and or Syria could explore in the Syrian continental shelf with Turkish and Azerbaijani companies? I cannot imagine that Israelis will be allowed in the Syrian continental shelf anytime soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel.
So, to me?
Yes, and I'll chip in as well. Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to speculate, just the brainstorm or lot speaking together. I don't think that this agreement between Sokar and other Israeli partners was coordinated by Ankara. I don't think that, because I know a little bit the Sokar's perspective. Sokar is interested in some of the drilling projects in all around the world they are analyzing, and most probably Tamar and other Israeli offshore project came as a good opportunity for them. And we know that Azerbaijan and Israel, they have good relations diplomatically and economically. So that's why I think it was an independent decision of the Baku. The second question, well, in 2014, I do remember that 2014 and 2015, basically, when Turkey and Israel was conducting gas sales and purchase agreements for the Leviathan field and other offshore fields, basically some Turkish companies wanted to be part of the upstream as well at that time. And that offer was not very welcomed by the Israeli decision makers, because they were considering that upstream, midstream, and downstream, these three value chains of the industry should be separated. However, since Turkish Petroleum has huge flexibility, thanks to 3 drilling ships that owns, and the 4th is going to be online, as well as based on the recent agreement that Turkey signed with Somalia for the upstream campaign. The thing is that Turkish Petroleum can be looking for other offshore fields, especially in Syria as well. However, when it comes to Syria, what is going to be the concessions of the Russian companies that they have about the offshore of the Syria? This is a very big question mark. So again, loudly speaking, Israel and Syria, maybe they are not very close nowadays. However, Turkish Petroleum, as well as other international companies, might have some role in the Syria, but still very early to discuss these opportunities.
And there's one, yeah, please.
Hi, Matt Kwazaborski with the Neptune Leadership Academy. Ambassador Pyatt, this question might be for you. Recently, when I've been doom scrolling, let's say, on certain websites, I've seen comments that Nord Stream 2 might be part of Mr. Witkoff's plan when he represents President Trump in Moscow. Is Nord Stream 2 like reigniting that under a discussion as a possibility?
So thank you for raising that, and it's also something Daphne raised, which I didn't get around to. And I would just make 2 observations. One, as I said, in Houston last week, the European contingent could not have been more clear in terms of their intention never to return to a situation of dependence on Russian gas. In fact, Energy Commissioner Jorgensen put it like this. He said, my #1 job is to end the flow of energy resources which fuels the Russian war machine. And he underlined his determination to implement the EU target of a full phase out of Russian gas by 2027. If there was an interest in Europe in softening their approach to Russian gas imports, there would be many opportunities to do so that would not require the massive levels of investment that it would take to restore the Nord Stream infrastructure. And in fact, one of the priorities that Commissioner Jorgensen and other European leaders at CERAWeek also highlighted was their intention to see further progress this year, 2025, against Russian LNG imports. So I can't speak for the White House or whatever negotiations are being conducted with the Kremlin. I'm quite certain that it's a strategic priority for the Kremlin to restore Russia's energy coercive power over the European Union. I'm also quite proud of the Biden administration's record, much faster than would have been predicted when I was ambassador in Greece when the war began in 2022, the Biden administration's successful support to Europe in managing its decoupling. So you can see why the Kremlin wants to turn back that clock. I don't see how that's in the strategic interests of the United States of America, including the LNG producers and gas producers of the Permian Basin, who have no interest in seeing Russia restored to a position where it can compete with U.S. product.
Thank you. Okay, so do I have a permission to take 2 last questions? No? So, okay, so my team doesn't let me to. So if, please, address the, ask the questions after the, just conference, as the conference is over, and I'd like to thank you, just Ebru, Özdemir, Eser, and Ambassador Pyatt, joining me today, and also to all of you to this wonderful debate. So now our next session is on transatlantic trade, and particularly with a focus on Turkey-US trade relationship. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final panel of today's conference, Transatlantic Trade, with a focus on US-Turkey relations. My name is Jennifer Miel. I'm the Executive Director of the US-Turkey Business Council at US Chamber and Vice President for Middle East, Turkey, and Central Asia at the US Chamber. I'm honored and delighted to be here today with this spectacular panel, blending experience from government, private sector, and think tank universe. We have Mr. Mark Mowry, who's former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative covering Europe and Turkey in particular. 42 years of service in the U.S. government within USTR, Commerce Department, and State Department. He will share some deep insights about U.S.-Turkey relations and what we might expect in the near future. We have Charles Litchfield, who's Deputy Director here at the Atlantic Council in Geoeconomics. And he will share the updates about the Trump administration's approach to the economy and to trade and commercial diplomacy. And we are delighted to have with us Ayşem Sargin, based in Istanbul. She's the Deputy Chair for the American Chamber of Commerce in Turkey and has held numerous roles in business associations in the private sector in Turkey throughout her career, as well as with the U.S. Embassy. So with that, I'd just like to begin reflecting on some of the remarks we heard today and the last two panels on energy and defense, which leads us here to trade. And it's quite frequently over the US-Turkey relationship and trajectory has been so fundamental defense relations. But right now we're at this pivotal time where trade relations is actually a fundamental pillar of our relations. You heard from Ambassador Önal and from General Jones today that our trade has reached $34 billion, that's in goods. Added services on top of that, we're at $40 billion of trade per year between our countries. In fact, our countries are more economically integrated than ever. Turkey, as you heard, has the US as the second largest export market, and the US is the fifth largest supplier to Turkey in terms of goods. So we really want to probe today how the commercial diplomacy approach of the Trump administration, particularly looking at Europe and Turkey, Europe being Turkey's largest trading partner, will impact US-Turkey relations. And we'll also touch upon how recent domestic developments in Turkey may affect the market and investor sentiment. And so we'd love to start with Ayşem Hanım, who's on the ground in Istanbul and can speak to us about what the US business footprint is currently in Turkey. So Ayşem, if you could share a little bit of facts and figures from AmCham's perspective.
Sure, Jennifer, it's nice to see you, and hello to everyone, including our panel participants. There are over 2,000 US-based firms registered in Turkey today. As AmCham, we represent more than 150 US member companies, and the total investment by these companies amount to $15 billion. The economic impact is multiple times this amount, but the exact number is around 15 billion. Direct and indirect total jobs that we create as US companies is around 100,000 jobs. So it is a big economic scale, big economic impact if you look at what we represent as AmCham alone. These companies are not just economic contributors, but also long-term partners to Turkey's development, bringing world-class expertise, innovation, and global market access, enabling global market access too. We see a diverse landscape when we look at the US businesses in Turkey. There's higher representation when you look at the whole picture in technology, manufacturing, healthcare, logistics, aerospace. As you know, I'm part of that crew. We know that all the US multinational invested in Turkey, when we look at them, these are all who's, and we represent all the well-known companies in our member base. So we sometimes talk about how we increase US investments in Turkey and what we should be targeting, but then really all the big ones are already in Turkey for long years. These companies' contributions to the Turkish economy come in different ways. Some of them are among the top manufacturing sector investors in Turkey. One good example to this is our valued member, the Ford company, for instance. Its successful partnership with Koç Holding, Ford Otosan, built Europe's largest production hub in Turkey. With more than 25,000 employees, Ford Otosan accounts for around 80% of Turkey's total commercial vehicle production and 98% of Turkey's commercial vehicle exports. Last year, their export volume was $13 billion. It has been a company that was the export champion of Turkey for several years of consecutive success in this area. So the impact is huge. Another important contribution, I would say, is through global value chains. Many of the companies, AmCham member companies, let me focus on that because we have some statistics around that. 4 out of 10 AmCham Turkey members have Turkish partners engaged in global value chains. So every company, on average, is working with 4 local suppliers. So it is a significant number too. Think about the technology transfer, know-how transfer that these companies have with their local partners, local supply chain stakeholders. But beyond that, imagine the high value added jobs these sectors create. And depending on the sector, the contribution in terms of industrial manufacturing and high value added exports is great. And as an example, I can give you our own company's success in this area. Over the past decade, our total work placement in Turkey was $2 billion, which meant, of course, that much industrial production and that much exports for our aerospace parts manufacturers, our partners in Turkey. Another important area we see as significant investments made by US companies in Turkey is in R&D and engineering. 1/5 of our members have dedicated R&D or innovation centers in Turkey. And close to 10% of their annual revenue in Turkey is allocated to R&D. Around 20% of their workforce is dedicated to engineering and R&D. These are big numbers. And finally, maybe worth mentioning is how Turkey is serving as a regional hub, regional base for many American companies. We think there's a potential to grow here too, but because of the proximity advantage that Turkey has to some big markets like Europe, like Central Asia, Middle East, Africa. I was just listening to the previous panelists and hearing about the energy advantages, a topic close to my heart. But beyond that too, for many US companies, Turkey has evolved to be a trusted partner when it comes to playing a regional base role with regard to supply chain engagement or any logistics operations too. So these are the areas that US companies are contributing to mainly. I can't count all of them. But again, to scale things in your mind, Turkey recorded around $11.3 billion of foreign direct investment inflow last year in 2024. And 10.3% of this FDI came from US companies. And the content is important too. This came in fields of technology. There were several M&As in gaming industry, for instance. So things are happening in Turkey, and US companies have been real partners being a part of Turkey's growth story. Let me stop here. I know we'll continue to chat about the rest of the issues on the agenda.
Great, thank you very much, Ayşem Hanım. And certainly you see from the AmCham's footprint how strategic of a country that Turkey is for US companies. The US Chamber of Commerce is going to be bringing the first delegation under the Trump administration to Ankara and Istanbul this April. timed with big announcements that are likely to come from Washington following a systematic review of trade policy for G20 nations, of which Turkey, of course, is one. So I'd like to turn to Charles now to talk to us a little bit more about the Trump administration's trade policy and how they're approaching trade, both in their articulated policy and also what we see in their actions.
Well, I don't mean to be the voice of doom and gloom in this wonderful conference. There are many things that the US and Turkey can continue to achieve together, irrespective of volatility in policy making in Washington. However, it's important to acknowledge that this community that we all have here, think tankers, people who work in trade, industrial chambers, the important work that's done by AmCham Turkey, we've all evolved a little bit, I think it's fair to say, in our assessment of what the Trump administration wants to do on trade policy and how it is prepared to achieve it. The average person, me and myself included, during the transition might have said to you, the tariffs are something that Trump likes, but they're a bargaining chip and a negotiating device. I think we have to accept now that the tariffs are just appreciated for the sake of being tariffs. And that is a difference, a very big difference. Another change, and one thing that Turkey might be worried about, but so far hasn't been concerned by, is that the priority list is a little bit surprising, and that the Trump administration has gone after long-standing allies, close allies of the US, before adversaries. Now, that's not entirely true. A lot of it is to do with the headlines. Every time we've been worried about whether or not there will be a 25% tariff on the US's closest geographic partners, they've slipped in 10% tariffs on China, which actually haven't made that much news because everyone was so concerned about the 25%. But this is an environment where and actually, there is now a 25% tariff on Canada as well. That came a month later. So this is an environment where it's very hard to make up scenarios that are long-standing and that help you make business decisions that are there to stay. I think that's a challenge, including for people working on the US-Turkey relationship. What does Trump want to achieve with the tariffs? I think there's clearly a return of manufacturing jobs. There is also this goal of generating revenue and at some point using that to replace income tax and dropping income tax, although the most recent promise is that income taxes will not be brought down unless the US manages to close its deficit, so that may take a little bit of time. But there are all sorts of goals other than negotiating with partners that perhaps we underestimated during the transition. Is this a concern for Turkey? Turkey was targeted by US tariffs under the first Trump administration. The US can have an independent policy towards Turkey in what tariffs it charges, but Turkey has to take the European response in how it responds. So I think most people in this room probably know this, but maybe for people watching online, this is part of the Turkey's relationship with the EU. Turkey is part of the customs union and therefore has to apply EU tariffs. And I think this increases the risk in some way that Turkey is caught in the crossfire between the EU and the US. When the EU decides to retaliate, and it will, against US tariffs, Turkey will have to apply the higher rates that the EU decides on. There is also some opportunity because maybe at some point the US and the US and the EU will decide to reduce tariffs, but there's risk there as well because if a specific deal is done outside most favored nation terms between the US and the US does not necessarily have to afford the same favors to the EU that it does to Turkey. So we're very far away from that. We're currently in the initial phase where it's more aggressive, but it's just one thing that we need to bear in mind, that even if we reach a more positive balance between the US and the EU, let's say in a few months, Turkey will not necessarily be privy to that deal that's done between the US and the EU. So those are the things that are concerning me. There is obviously a positive history of the Erdogan-Trump relationship and the goal that they set in 2018 of reaching 100 billion in mutual trade per year. We're very far from that now, between 30 and 40 billion. But there are obviously opportunities for US firms. My previous panelists mentioned that Turkey is a regional hub. I'd obviously like to see that grow a little bit more for US firms, but this is the reality we're in. A lot of uncertainty caused by the methods of the Trump administration and the risk that Turkey is caught in the crossfire. Some positives. The EU does want to deepen its relationship with Turkey more than it did previously. So everyone here is bored of hearing about customs union modernization because it hasn't really led anywhere recently. However, even before Trump won, so in July of last year, then Executive Vice President Dombrovskis met his counterpart to talk about customs union modernization. The sectors that were in the readout weren't necessarily the best of news for Turkey, so what Turkey's really interested in is agriculture and healthcare. What was mentioned there was more the sort of classic trade facilitation stuff, mobility, haulage, this sort of thing, things that are important and that do often cause some tension, but not really the new sectors that Turkey wants to get into that. Now that Trump is there, can we imagine that things will get better? I hope so, but I think it would be remiss of me not to mention recent political crises in Turkey, which do have a chilling effect on EU willingness to go further on the customs union. I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Charles, for those insights. We'd love to turn to Mark to hear how you're seeing the U.S. and Turkish government's approach to trade and commercial relations, and drawing upon what Charles had said. Do you see a difference between Trump's first term and second term?
Thanks very much, Jennifer, and thanks to the Council for inviting me. It's a very interesting discussion. All my conversations about Turkey throughout my career have been interesting. I think that we are, as Charles noted, in a very uncertain moment, particularly because we're nearing, according to the latest media reports, a decision point from the Trump administration about what sort of tariff regime is envisioned for the near future. Presumably, Turkey will be a part of a considered approach to structuring tariffs that will permit a lot more US-Turkish business collaboration. I think it's important to step back for a second and distinguish a bit between the kinds of commercial cooperation we're talking about. One is that outside the defense and energy sectors, which I have always seen as more organically driven, there's a lot of long-standing history between the US and Turkey in the defense industry. There is a lot of ongoing and, as we've just heard, future potential in the area of energy cooperation. The other parts of the commercial relationship have been the ones I've been most focused on over the years I've worked on Turkey. And I think those are the things that have been challenging for the two sides to improve, to enhance. As Aisham said, there's a lot that has been going on. When I first started working on Turkey in 2007, we are very far from that. There's a great deal of cooperation now in the commercial sectors, and more and more sophistication, I would say, in that cooperation. That said, we have been saying for 3 administrations now that the US-Turkey commercial relationship should be on a level on par at least, or at least as intense as our defense and energy relationship has been. It's been hard to get there. We've been seeing progress. We are now, as noted, in sort of a $35 billion two-way trade relationship. That's quite a bit above where I remember starting to look at Turkey. But is that close to $100 billion? Of course not. Is it close to $1 trillion? Well, of course not. But I think the point is that there continues to be a huge potential for US-Turkey commercial cooperation, which various factors get in the way of. One is the relationship between Turkey and the EU. So in a trade sense, that limits to some degree the freedom that companies have to engage with each other between the US and Turkey. It also presents opportunities, obviously. As Turkey's economy has grown over these past couple of decades, more and more opportunities crop up for US companies. The other is, I think, more a bilateral dynamic between the two governments and the two private sectors, where US companies have been reluctant to expand their cooperation in Turkey, their investment in Turkey, for numerous reasons. Some of those are structural to the Turkish economy. A fair amount of them have been political decisions taken by the Turkish government over the years. So getting to a point where companies feel more confident in these non-defense, non-energy sectors in particular, to put in their time, put in their money, secure their futures, if you will, with Turkish partners, we have to talk in greater detail about what it is that can be done by both governments to make that happen. Governments are only part of the solution, clearly, but they can make a big difference. And as we've all discussed today, governments can help the situation through various programs and policies, and they can also hinder it. What the Trump administration will do, none of us know. The difference, I think, between right now and when I was working in the USTR in the first Trump administration is this intensified focus, I would say, on merchandise trade balance, on using tariffs as a tool for any number of reasons. And where that leads us, obviously it's impossible to say until we know more, but also Turkey in particular, what sort of dynamic can be established between the two governments, or in a more regional sense, either with the EU or with global trading partners, G20 partners, to make the commercial relationship more fluid, to encourage more companies to put out the resources they would need to succeed. It is, as we all know, it's a tough area. It's a tough market. It's a tough neighborhood. And so a lot of U.S. companies are not automatically ready to put in their time and resources, but there's enormous opportunity. And so I think the next few weeks will give us a clearer picture of where this administration wants to go, and we should hope that the Turkish administration puts out the same kind of positive signaling that we've heard recently, so that we can get a more productive dialogue started. We have plenty of mechanisms in place, as we've heard. There's lots of fora, both government and private sector, where the two sides can come together. The question is the willingness there to ease the path, if you will, for companies to take bigger risks in both directions.
And Mark, if I can ask a follow-up question. So as USTR and Commerce Department are undergoing these reviews on trade policy, are they looking at it, to your knowledge, from a trade balance perspective? And do you think they'll draw any distinction between trade balance in goods versus trade balance in services?
What we've seen so far publicly is very much a focus on goods. I think that has been true from the start of the first Trump administration. So I think that through line is there. Services are not something that's going to be ignored, but the rhetoric, at least so far, and the sorts of conversations that I've heard about are heavily focused on merchandise trade. And this idea of reciprocity, I think both sides have expressed this now, repeated it. And so where does that lead? How do you manage that sort of thing? All those details need to be filled in.
And Charles, if you can guide us on how the tariffs may impact Turkey's economy, and would love to hear from your perspective as well, how you think Europe may respond and Turkey in kind.
Maybe one just small remark on how different countries are being considered and how they're being assessed as the Trump administration, as part of the America First trade policy, analyzes where things are now. They have put out unofficially a list of the dirty 15 countries that they have a big problem with. Turkey is not one of these, and the two criteria they use to assess countries are trade surplus. Big trade surplus with the US is a problem, and also whether their tariffs on average are higher than the tariffs the US applies to them. So on the trade surplus, Turkey doesn't have a problem, doesn't have a big trade surplus with the US. On the tariffs, it does have a bit of a problem, which ties into what we were discussing earlier, the fact that the EU tariff is on average a little bit higher than the US tariff, and Turkey applies the EU tariff. I'm more worried about the scenario a few months down the line when Turkey has to apply the EU retaliation tariffs against the US, and then Turkey might get noticed by the people who've made the Dirty 15 list, more than they have previously. So the initial salvo of tariffs, which in some ways is already coming, there's already the steel and aluminium 25% tariff, which will include Turkey. But then when the EU is specifically targeted, perhaps for having a higher rate than the US, and the US does reciprocal tariffs, logistically quite difficult, but they are preparing for it. That is where you may have a bit more of a problem. Turkey's trade with the US isn't huge, as we've already mentioned, unfortunately. So I think in the short term it will be able to fall back on its other trading partners. I don't foresee a big impact on GDP, on inflation in Turkey just because of the tariff war. I'm more worried about what happens a few months down the line. Fragmentation of trade globally, mutual retaliations, and specifically the Turkey getting caught up in an EU retaliation over which it has little to no control. But in terms of economic dependency on the US, I don't think you'd see an impact immediately.
Right, and because Turkey has followed the European approach on some digital policies, such as digital services tax, and looking to make similar changes to its competition law in line with Digital Markets Act, and we've seen the Trump administration's response in the previous administration and now in the current administration on Digital Markets Act. Any thoughts about how Turkey may get caught up in that?
If the Trump administration decides to impose specific tariffs to do with that, Turkey will be on the list, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let's hear from Ayşem Hanım in Istanbul about how U.S. companies are navigating some of the opportunities that macroeconomic trends have presented themselves in Turkey, and also some of the challenges around uncertainty and looming risks. Ayşem, I think you have you on mute.
Thanks for that. I was just interested in the conversation that you were having on the impact of retaliatory tariffs that EU may implement against US and how that would impact Turkey. We are now trying to understand that, talking to the Ministry of Trade, trying to understand the impact. Overall, they didn't see much impact. Of course, we probably didn't consider, as we discussed this, maybe they didn't deeply consider some items that would be affected due to customs unions binding conditions, but we should definitely take a look at that and try to see what's next. So far, if you look at it from a tariffs perspective, at least we know that for the goods coming directly from originating from the United States and coming into Turkey, there is no additional burden that Turkey is getting from the newly announced tariffs against EU. So in a way, somehow this worked out to the advantage of Turkey versus EU. It may have some implications for supply chain activity. That's why there has been some discussion on that. But we haven't gotten a direct response on what happens if there are additional measures taken by the EU that may be binding due to customs union for Turkey as well. So that's something to look into, which would definitely be one of the risks that we should be talking about in the session. But beyond that, Jennifer, as you know, the economic program, the recent economic program, the improvement in macro trends, seeing realistic projections made by the government, seeing how the program is progressing, it had a really good impact on all the investors, including American investors, of course. It's restored the trust in the Turkish economy. For the past few years, we didn't have that, and we could see the difference. And we went through a time when Turkey also successfully managed a very challenging geopolitical landscape with multiple wars, regional conflicts. So during that time, I think we got as close as we could to a stable environment, investment environment in Turkey. After several years of really not much visibility over what's next. That was one challenge all the investors, international investors in Turkey had, including the US investors. Of course, going through this, navigating through this program, one big challenge we all faced, again, I think local companies faced the same challenge too. Local companies, especially relying on exports faced a similar challenge because the gap between inflation rates and the exchange rate was high, has been high, it's still high. And in an economy where you can't balance this, it reflects to your costs inevitably. So the cost of labor has increased dramatically for many of the investors in Turkey. So the economic program was positive. So the visibility, the predictability in terms of macroeconomic fundamentals was really an asset for all the investors. But then cost-wise, competitiveness over this time was not the same as what we used to have in the past as international companies. So that cost competitiveness issue was surely one of the issue. And then there's the global protectionism. Even before the new administration and the increasing focus on tariffs, as we all know, this started during the time of COVID, during the time of pandemic, and we started talking about all these concepts like friendshoring, onshoring, particularly in strategic sectors. We have been talking about this and seeing these shifts in the supply chain specifically about these critical goods. We saw more regional alliances rather than multilateral trade frameworks. So this was in a way coming, it just got intensified, upgraded with the current administration. And then, of course, we saw the geopolitics, how big a role geopolitics started playing over again the past few years after the pandemic, who you should be trusting overall in order to sign many years of deals with its industry, to lay a pipeline that transfers energy. These are long-term investments. These are investments based on trust. You can build based on trust. And this has also played a significant role. So during this time, again, Turkey's efforts to create a balance in the region, balancing the power in the region, have been very positive for the investors. Of course, Turkey is not immune to protectionism, continues to have some advantages even after the pandemic because of its proximity to Europe as a major market. Turkey is blessed. I think it's the only country in the region that has a functioning, strong industry. It has a free market economy. It has the right institutions in place, and it has democracy. These are the qualifications that set aside Turkey from the rest of the region to the east of Turkey, let's say. So given all of this, we all know that stability matters for all investors. And stability comes in different ways. Geopolitics has become more of an agenda item for all of us. Internal politics is surely another important indicator for all the investors. And you were talking about the last days. We should be able to protect our valuable assets, the ones that I was just counting as the criteria that set Turkey aside from the other countries in the region. So that is important. And of course, macroeconomic stability and predictability, they are critical in order to grow the investments, keep the investments in Turkey. And then looking at these geopolitical positioning, global power balances, considering the current global volatility, more than ever, investors will be prioritizing stability and predictability over anything else. Macroeconomic stability will continue to be a part of the story, of course, but I call it a global reset. I think maybe the biggest one after the pandemic, I think we are going through now. And we should position ourselves as Turkey we should see Turkey position itself as an attractive investment destination again. And thinking about who would consider investments in Turkey, I think the bigger, the higher possibility, the tendency of the existing investors in Turkey to invest more, maybe grow their manufacturing base, increase capacity in their existing investments, is a higher possibility, given Turkey's location in possibly benefiting from these tariffs, high tariff environment, maybe being excluded from certain additional tax or tariff burdens. Turkey can reposition itself again as a favorable investment destination beyond the newcomers. Even the existing big American companies in Turkey could consider growing their existing investments in Turkey, because we have witnessed several challenges, Turkey going through several challenges, and we managed through all of those and wanted to grow in this country, seeing the opportunities too. But then I think Turkey needs to do its part and help us navigate through this environment. I think the past couple of years was a good experience on how Turkey could do that, manage that, and we hope to see that continue.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Ayşem. I couldn't agree more, a lot of the points that you mentioned. And we do have a lot of incentives for US and Turkish governments to reach an agreement, if you will, on a lot of these trade disputes. There's actually a pipeline of about $50 billion of deals between US and Turkey, a lot of them defense, aviation, and energy. So how might these deals benefit the US consumer, the US economy, and how could they be utilized as incentives to reach some type of an agreement? Mark, Charles.
Who wants to start? Well, it depends on how these deals are structured. And would the U.S. government be seen as the key interlocutor on the U.S. side, or should this be a business-to-business decision? I think, by and large, the idea is that the businesses should be able to deal with each other and come up with what makes sense. To the extent governments can facilitate those conversations, then I think that is helpful. If governments try to interpose themselves as the deciders, if you will, on whether these deals go forward, then that likely complicates things in ways that may or may not be very helpful. So I think it really depends on what sort of commitments business leaders are willing to make, and will they make those commitments dependent on what governments do to help them. They're looking for government financing for various projects. Well, that can be done, but is that necessary to make some of the deals happen, or most of the deals happen? It depends very much on the details. It's great to have the money available. It's great to have the intent there. But in the end, it's going to be a company by company, sector by sector set of circumstances that's going to make these happen or not. I think what has been frustrating to me over the years working on Turkey is that so much of this willingness to try to engage has been there, especially on the private sector and on government sectors as well. But somehow or other it doesn't come together. And sometimes that is because of government actions or inactions. And sometimes it is just because the business case can't be made. And so this isn't a moment of great opportunity, but as all of us have said, I think so far, also a great challenge. And will those key resources be unlocked and available to make the relationship grow meaningfully from here?
I agree with all of that. There are just a few things perhaps that government can ensure it can do to facilitate trade, especially and investment, especially in the areas that are already working quite well. So historically, because of the US-Turkey defense relationship, you have had good partnerships there. But 2 points. One, under the previous Trump administration, mainly under influence from Congress, the US actually sanctioned Turkey for its purchase of we don't need to go over the right and the wrong of what happened, although I think history has proven that that particular purchase wasn't a very wise decision from Turkey, irrespective of its relationship with the US. But we're now in 2025, making sure that latent sanctions left behind by by the act of Congress, by CAATSA, making sure that those are lifted now that it's pretty clear that the SS-300 system will not be used, so that these defense partnerships can grow again. That's the first point, but an important one. And the second one is that Turkey has shown an amazing capacity for innovation and trying to make sure that US firms observe and respect this type of innovation and try to integrate it into what they do. There's a lot to learn from what Bayraktar and others have done in Turkey over the past few years. And I'm not sure we're fully harnessing the power of that potential in the US.
Just add one thing. One of the things I kept referring to when I interacted with my Turkish colleagues over the years was familiarity is the key. If one side is more familiar with the other market, then they at least have a basis of knowledge from which to work. If they're ignorant, then that will be a self-limiting problem. And a lot of Turkish companies have yet to learn how to penetrate the US market. It's not the easiest market to penetrate, for sure. Vice versa. I think that what governments can also do is to try to bring people together. Look at Carl from USTDA. He's done enormously great work over the years to try to make that happen. Getting people together, getting them to know each other is key, no matter what sector you're talking about, no matter what deal you're talking about. So that's going to remain a challenge. That is something that governments can certainly contribute to, as well as private associations. It's not enough, obviously, always, but it's a start. And so I think that as the situation evolves over the next months, whatever governments and the private sector can do to acquaint each other with circumstances and opportunities, that's going to make a big difference.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we may have time for one question, if there is any. Please, if we can get a microphone. If you could kindly state your name and affiliation.
Thank you. My name is Aldair. I'm a research intern at the Caspian Policy Center, currently pursuing a master's degree at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. I'd like to address the question to all of you. Given the ongoing extraordinary protests and the recent arrest of a key opposition figure with presidential ambitions, how do you see these developments impacting investor sentiment and US-Turkey trade relations moving forward? Thank you.
Badly. You have already seen the market reaction. The Turkish stock market and the New York index on Turkish stocks both fell between 8 and 12% on Wednesday. The lira fell a little bit, but recovered some of its depreciation. And government bond yields on government bonds also increased, so making it more expensive for Turkey to borrow. And this is a market which was dominated by domestic actors, but foreign actors have developed a renewed interest in since the arrival of the new economics team. So I don't think you'll get much disagreement on this panel that these developments are bad for confidence in Turkey and the attractiveness to investors. I would say, though, that the current economic team is very popular with international investors. And so this is Finance Minister Şimşek, the governor of the central bank, Mr. Karahan. Popular, they know what they're doing, they're quite good at explaining what they're doing, and Erdogan is happy to use them to put them out on the stage to explain what's going on, and they did actually respond quite quickly, explaining that there was no risk to their economic plan. Irrespective of political developments, which I would be happy to criticize, the economics team, it seems, is being left in place and has the confidence of the president. There's still a little bit of political interference, some questions over whether, for instance, the economics team's efforts to basically promote austerity and not increase in wages in pace with inflation. Occasionally you get a little comment within the AKP party, perhaps we could increase wages a little bit, because of course bringing down inflation and breaking the wage price spiral is one of the priorities. I'm not saying that they're completely independent from political pressure, but they're a key part of the messaging from Erdogan that there's domestic politics, but on the economics I'm maintaining my course, so you markets need not worry. And then Investors can make up their mind, of course, but he's using his economics team, which is popular, in a way which suggests that they still have control of the economic agenda.
Aisha, Mark, did you have anything to add? Nope. Okay, maybe one more question if there's one. Yes.
I think that was a great question. And to add to that, overall, we were just talking about how all investors, well, all short-term investors, considering the reaction we were just talking about in the financial markets that we saw, and also long-term investors, of course. All the investors want stability, predictability, and anything that disturbs that, of course, receives negative reaction. We hope to go back to that predictable environment again, I think, which we all enjoyed over the past couple of years.
Great, well, thank you, Aisha. It looks like we are at time, but I really want to thank all of our panelists for discussing both some of the short-term impacts that we've seen happen just this week and the medium and longer term of what's to expect between US and Turkey under the new Trump administration, the enormous opportunities that are here with the $50 billion pipeline of investments that can take place, and of course the trade and reciprocal tariff measures that may be announced within the next few weeks. So thank you, Mark, thank you, Charles, thank you, Aisha Hanım, for joining us from Istanbul, and thank you to everyone in the audience, especially Defne Hanım and Atlantic Council.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for gathering us today, and also for those who have been with us, just across the Atlantic. And until next time. So thank you again for joining.